Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a world where love didn't start with dating apps, candlelit dinners, or even clear eyesight, because honestly, half of medieval romance began with a single glance across a courtyard, sometimes while carrying a bucket of water, and sometimes while trying not to trip over your own tunic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where are you watching from and what time is it there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking across uneven cobblestones in a small medieval town, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the faint tang of manure, bread, and damp wool. The day has just begun. The bell in the chapel has rung for morning prayers, and as you pass through the market square, you notice how people's eyes meet briefly, carefully, as if looking too long might summon gossip faster than a town crier. In the medieval world, love often began where people gathered for routine chores, fetching water from the communal well, trading eggs for candles, or attending Mass, where eye contact during the Peace Be With You exchange could feel far more electric than holy. You glance toward the fountain, where a young woman adjusts her veil and pretends to study the ripples while a mason across the way pretends not to look. You can almost hear his thoughts, how one smile could undo months of pretending he wasn't smitten. In truth, medieval love was a public spectacle disguised as secrecy. Villages were small, and everyone knew who lingered too long by whose gate. Still, people found ways to make chance encounters seem accidental. Dropping a kerchief near someone's boots could spark days of whispered curiosity, though heaven help you if a priest saw it, because that innocent gesture might earn you a lecture about lust and eternal peril. But love had a funny way of slipping through cracks in the cobblestones and loopholes in doctrine. A mainstream historical fact for you. In the 12th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine's court at Poitiers became a kind of laboratory for romantic expression, where nobles practiced courtly love, a stylized, almost theatrical devotion that valued longing more than consummation. Of course, that high-born ritual rarely matched what happened in the muddy streets below, where affection was clumsy, unspoken, and bound by necessity rather than poetry. Yet, across social classes, the same nervous energy pulsed, the same thrill of being seen and not condemned. One quirky tidbit tucked into medieval folklore suggests that if two people washed their hands in the same basin at a festival, they were destined to share a kiss before the year's end. Imagine the chaos at a harvest fair when someone realized they'd just washed beside the wrong spouse. But despite all superstition and song, there was always one common thread. The moment of first sight carried immense symbolic power. The Church warned against the sin of the eyes, insisting that temptation entered through a lingering glance, while poets swore that love itself began with sight and refined the soul. Scholars still debate whether medieval attraction leaned more toward spiritual admiration or carnal fascination. Was it love of the divine reflected in another's face, or just infatuation wrapped in incense and guilt? You'll hear both arguments echoing through time, each as persuasive as the other. The setting around you feels alive. The smell of hay and barley, the low murmur of bartering voices, the rustle of skirts brushing past. Someone strums a lute nearby, and you notice how sound carries differently in this stone maze of alleys and courtyards. A single note can linger long enough for someone to imagine it was played just for them. You catch sight of a baker's apprentice sneaking glances at the brewer's daughter while pretending to stack barrels, his face redder than the fire in the oven behind him. Their entire romance might unfold over months of awkward eye contact, half smiles, and the occasional strategically spilled sack of flour. It's all very delicate, this dance between propriety and desire. In a way, it's almost poetic, because love here isn't shouted, it's whispered, coded, and constantly at risk of being punished. If you lean close enough, you can almost hear the soft gossip carried on the wind. Women at the well murmuring about who smiled too brightly at Sunday Mass. Men joking about knights who write poems for women they'll never touch. And yet beneath the teasing there's envy. Everyone longs for that dangerous kind of connection, the one that feels like both salvation and sin. The air hums with it. The courtyard becomes less a place for chores and more a theater for subtle emotion. Even the pigeons seem to coo conspiratorially, as if they've seen too many secret exchanges to be impressed anymore. So you stand there, half amused, half enchanted, realizing that falling in love in medieval times wasn't about passion alone, it was about navigating a minefield of eyes, tongues, and divine warnings. Every step toward affection was a small rebellion, every look a gamble, and yet love persisted. Awkward, improvised, radiant, and absurdly human. As the church bell tolls again and shadows stretch across the courtyard, you can't help but smile, thinking that maybe humanity hasn't changed so much after all. Because whether it's a bucket of water, a glance across a feast, or a swipe on a screen, it always begins the same way, with two people pretending they aren't looking and both knowing they are. You stroll deeper into this medieval world, where emotions had to disguise themselves in petals, cloth, and the subtlest gestures imaginable, because saying I love you out loud could invite ridicule, scandal, or, depending on who overheard, a lifetime of unwanted sermons. Picture this. You're in a marketplace surrounded by baskets of lavender, rosemary, and wild thyme, the air thick with the smell of honey and tallow candles, and people aren't just buying herbs for soup or soap, they're sending coded messages through their bouquets. A sprig of rosemary meant remembrance, a violet promised modesty, and if someone dared to slip you a red carnation, well, you could expect every gossip within a mile to start whispering before sunset. This was the secret language of affection, a full-blown communication system that required more imagination than any love letter. Because in a time when ink and privacy were luxuries, flowers became confessions wrapped in fragrance. And yes, some took it far enough to turn every errand into a covert operation. Women would tie herbs into their belts to signal interest or hide certain blossoms in their sleeves for the right eyes to notice. The glove game, though, was next-level genius. Gloves were intimate objects, worn close to the skin, carrying traces of one's scent, and to give or return one was practically a declaration. If a knight received a lady's glove before a tournament, it wasn't just fabric, it was a challenge, a blessing and a flirtation rolled into one. The mainstream historical fact here, Queen Elizabeth I's courtiers later adopted glove-giving as a token of esteem, but its roots trace back to the 12th century, when knights carried women's gloves into battle or hung them from lances as proof of devotion. Imagine fighting a duel with a silk glove fluttering near your sword hand. It's half romance, half reckless symbolism. A fringe tidbit from lesser-known lore even claimed that if a woman dropped a glove intentionally at a feast and a man picked it up without being asked, he'd bound himself to her in secret affection until the next full moon. Try explaining that kind of curse to your wife when the moonlight hits your door wrong. The beauty of this silent courtship language is how seriously people took it. Every detail mattered. The color of the ribbon around the bouquet, the hand used to offer it, even the direction it faced. Red roses tilted right might whisper passion. The same roses tilted left could mean farewell. Some scholars argue that medieval floriography wasn't nearly as structured as later Victorians imagined, while others insist there were genuine regional codes passed through songs and riddles. It's one of those debates historians love to duel over with quills instead of swords, and it proves how easily our ancestors turned everyday items into love letters. And gloves weren't the only wearable metaphors. There were girdles, decorative belts symbolizing loyalty, lace tokens worn near the heart, and even shoe ribbons that hinted at mutual affection, subtle signals meant for those fluent in the language of glances. You imagine yourself at a spring festival, music echoing through the fields, and everyone pretending not to notice the small exchanges happening beneath garlands of flowers. A young man brushes pollen from a woman's sleeve, just a moment too gently. A noblewoman passes a ribbon to a minstrel as payment for a song that she requested twice. It's an entire society of quiet rebellion, where the simplest objects could mean everything. You find yourself smiling at the thought. How love here is patient, resourceful, and slyly creative. It's romance forced through the cracks of propriety, where a single misstep could destroy reputations, but a correctly folded glove could ignite a connection that outlived the scandal. And maybe that's the charm. The world around you hums with risk and restraint, the constant awareness that desire has to hide beneath formality. Yet somehow that makes every symbol matter more. The act of handing someone a flower is slow, deliberate, and full of trembling hope. You feel it, too, the way tension lives in every pause, every unnecessary adjustment of a glove strap. It's almost funny how, despite the layers of social armor, people still found ways to whisper across a crowded room. You glance down at your own hands and imagine the weight of a glove offered in secret, a simple token that might change everything. And you can't help but wonder if love was stronger precisely because it wasn't allowed to speak its name. You wander now through the soundscape of the Middle Ages, and suddenly the air is alive with music, not the polished concert kind, but something far more human. A single voice carried through stone courtyards and moonlit fields, singing about love so impossible that even the stars lean closer to listen. Troubadours, those wandering poets of southern France, made falling in love an art form that could ruin reputations and win eternal fame in the same breath. Picture yourself beneath a castle balcony, where a young knight, half nervous, half dramatic, tunes his lute and clears his throat before daring to serenade the lady of the house. The melody wobbles at first, perhaps because he's terrified her father might appear with a sword, but somehow that trembling makes the performance more real. That's the thing about medieval romance. It was equal parts danger and devotion, a performance as risky as any duel. A mainstream historical fact tells us that troubadours emerged in the 11th century in Occitania, crafting songs that blended refined poetry with emotional honesty, turning courtly love into both entertainment and social commentary. Their verses traveled faster than letters and echoed through generations, setting the tone for centuries of heartbreak ballads to come. The quirky tidbit: some troubadours wrote songs addressed to completely imaginary women, constructed ideals meant to represent pure love, unsullied by reality. It's the medieval equivalent of falling for someone on a painting. There's even one notorious account of a troubadour who claimed his muse was an angel he saw in a dream, and he insisted on writing her love poems until his friends begged him to please get more sleep. That dreamlike devotion spread across Europe like wildfire, inspiring the German minnesingers, the Italian stilnovisti, and eventually the Renaissance notion that suffering nobly for love was the highest mark of civilization. Of course, scholars still debate whether these performers truly lived what they sang or just exaggerated to earn coin and applause. Were they sincere lovers or early influencers? The question lingers like a refrain. You picture the scene again. The courtyard bathed in candlelight, tapestries fluttering in the night breeze, the soft plucking of strings echoing against stone. A lady leans from her balcony, pretending not to listen, while every servant within earshot absolutely is. The troubadour sings about unattainable love, about purity, loyalty, and longing, so intense it feels almost holy. There's a strange comfort in how melodramatic it all is. In a world full of plagues, wars, and famine, at least heartbreak made people feel alive. And it wasn't only nobles who swooned. Villagers mimicked the style, singing crude parodies about bakers and shepherdesses that somehow carried the same emotional punch. You realize that even now, centuries later, we haven't stopped doing the same thing. Only now our lutes are replaced with guitars, our balconies with comment sections, The music wraps around you like a spell. You can almost feel the hum of the strings through your chest, that intimate vibration that makes every word sound truer than it probably is. The troubadour ends his song with a dramatic flourish, kneels and leaves the courtyard before anyone can respond. That's part of the ritual, too. Love expressed, then withdrawn, yearning preserved like wine sealed in a cask, because in this world, the chase was everything. Desire was meant to be admired, not fulfilled. You watch the lady place her hand over her heart, half smiling, half aching, knowing full well that she'll never see him again. And for just a second, under the echo of that fading melody, you understand why this culture of impossible love lasted so long, because sometimes it's the longing itself that keeps people awake, dreaming of what could have been, long after the last note fades into the night. You settle into a dim candlelit chamber, its walls lined with rushes and the faint musty scent of ink and tallow, and it's here that love transforms from fleeting glances and music into words, deliberate, trembling, ink-stained words that must cross miles of danger and judgment to reach the right hands. You can almost hear the quiet scrape of a quill as someone dips it into a pot of dark iron gall ink, watching it glisten before it dries to a permanent brown mark on parchment. Writing a love letter in medieval times wasn't just an act of romance, it was an act of courage, and occasionally treason. You didn't simply pour your heart out. You navigated etiquette, theology, and social rank like a knight navigating a forest full of wolves. The parchment itself was precious, often cut from animal skin and smoothed for hours, so even deciding to write meant spending something rare. Letters weren't disposable, they were relics of emotion that could outlive their authors. You can imagine the first line trembling with hesitation, the words a blend of devotion and fear. To my most gentle and virtuous lady, because to address someone outside your station might mean your words would be burned, or worse, read aloud in front of everyone at court. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly here. By the 13th century, literacy among the European upper classes had increased enough that letter writing between lovers became an established custom, especially in noble circles. Monks, ironically, were often the scribes who helped compose these secret letters. Sometimes for the very nobles their vows forbade from passion. They would copy phrases from Latin poetry or scripture, reshaping them into something less scandalous but still brimming with suggestion. And since most correspondence required a seal, wax became another language of love. Each family's crest could reveal identity, but those desperate to hide affection melted candle wax instead. Anonymous, soft, and fleeting, sealing the confession with a fragile layer that could be easily broken and destroyed. Now, here comes a fringe tidbit for you. Some lovers supposedly sprinkled crushed rose petals or even drops of their own blood into the ink, believing it would bind the words with their essence. Romantic, yes, but imagine the horror of running out of parchment halfway through a heartfelt declaration and realizing you just bled on a very expensive piece of calfskin. Still, superstition made its mark on medieval correspondence. Even the way a letter was folded carried meaning. Folded inward meant secrecy, outward openness, tied with red thread, it hinted at passion, tied with green, it promised hope. It's absurd and beautiful all at once. The idea that an entire romance could depend on the angle of a fold and the color of a string. You picture one of these letters now, slipping from a gloved hand into a servant's pouch, destined to travel through mud, snow, and gossip. Every messenger risked exposure. Peasants who carried noble correspondence might be questioned, bribed, or even jailed if the letter's contents hinted at forbidden alliances. And yet, letters kept traveling. Tiny flares of emotion defying distance and propriety. You can almost feel the anticipation of waiting days or weeks for a reply. The slow agony of wondering whether your words reached the right heart or burned in some jealous rival's fireplace. The waiting itself became part of the ritual, feeding the intensity of what was written. The absence of a reply didn't always mean rejection. It might mean interception, or illness, or that fate had simply chosen another path. There's something hypnotic in imagining the rhythm of this old-world communication. Ink, fold, seal, pray. Lovers wrote in riddles, embedding secret codes known only to the two of them. A line from a psalm could be twisted to mean "I miss you." A casual mention of the moon could mean "meet me when it wanes." Even handwriting carried emotion. The slant of letters, the pressure of the quill, the hurried blur where emotion overtook control. And yes, sometimes those letters survived, pressed between pages of prayer books, rediscovered centuries later by scholars blushing their way through translations. That's the scholarly debate still humming around medieval love letters. Were they genuine expressions of passion or stylized exercises in rhetoric, practiced as a form of elite entertainment? Some argue that most nobles treated letter writing as a refined game of intellect. Others insist it was the most honest channel they had in a world that silenced affection. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a performance of sincerity that still somehow managed to feel sincere. You lean closer to the candlelight and imagine yourself writing one. What would you say, knowing that parchment costs more than a month's wages, ink stains forever, and anyone could read it before it reached the one you love? Maybe you'd write cautiously, letting your words hover between confession and metaphor. Your eyes remind me of the morning star, which I am forbidden to follow. Or maybe you'd risk everything and write plainly, "When I saw you, I forgot the name of God." The ink would tremble, the quill might splatter, and still you'd seal it with a sigh. It's an oddly touching thought that somewhere, centuries ago, someone did just that, under the same moonlight that now slips through your imaginary window. You can almost hear the soft crackle of sealing wax and smell the faint sweetness of honey used to polish the parchment. Love letters, like the troubadour songs before them, were a rebellion against silence. In a world ruled by arranged marriages and watchful eyes, a letter allowed people to create a private universe where they could speak freely, even if only through metaphor. The act of writing itself became proof of love, a ritual that demanded vulnerability and endurance. Because unlike a song or a fleeting glance, a letter couldn't vanish. It lingered, physical and incriminating, a risk pressed between folds of parchment. The courage to send it, knowing the danger, feels almost braver than the love it contained. So you sit there, quill in hand, candle flickering, your fingers ink-stained and trembling slightly. You imagine sealing your words with a drop of wax and pressing a borrowed ring into it for a makeshift crest. The air smells faintly of smoke and tallow, and the silence is thick enough to feel like someone listening. Somewhere, you know a messenger waits at the gate, impatient to ride into the night, hooves clattering against stone. You give the letter one last look, wondering if it will be read, if it will be believed, or if it will vanish like all secret things must. And as the candle burns lower, you realize something simple and universal, that love in any era is an act of faith. You send your words into the dark, and hope they'll find their way back to the light. You move now into a castle hall filled with tapestries, flickering torches, and the low murmur of nobles debating not war or land but love, as if it were a legal matter to be judged and codified. Because in a way it was. Welcome to the age of courtly love, the great medieval invention that turned desire into a chivalric science, where affection had its own commandments, protocols, and loopholes so intricate that even modern dating apps would seem refreshingly honest by comparison. It all began, they say, with a strange idea born in 12th century France, that love was not chaos or instinct but a refined art, to be practiced with the same discipline as swordsmanship or prayer. You imagine yourself sitting at the edge of a velvet-draped table beside nobles drinking spiced wine, as a troubadour recites the sacred rules of love, inspired by a cleric named Andreas Capellanus, whose De Amore, written for the court of Marie de Champagne, attempted the impossible task of defining how love should behave. The first rule, Love can only exist between equals. The second, marriage disqualifies you entirely. The third, you must keep your affair secret, and the rest spiral gloriously out of control, describing what to do when jealousy strikes, how long one may mourn an unfaithful lover, and why true love cannot thrive without the thrill of danger. A mainstream historical fact. This very book became the cornerstone of Europe's romantic ideals, influencing poets from Dante to Chaucer, and echoing through centuries of polite heartbreak. Picture the absurdity of it. Knights debating whether stealing a kiss violates the code. Ladies gathering in imitation courts of love to settle disputes about fidelity, and troubadours performing like legal witnesses to prove that someone's sigh was genuine and therefore binding. You half expect a bailiff to appear, announcing, "All rise for the lady of sincere affection." It's hilarious. Yes, but it reveals something profound about the medieval mind. Love was seen as both divine and dangerous, a passion that needed rules lest it consume everyone in scandal. The church preached chastity, the nobles preached passion, and somewhere in between, ordinary people just tried to figure out how to survive a crush without losing their social standing. There was even a ranking system. Love was simple when unreciprocated, mixed when mutual but platonic, and perfect when both spiritual and physical yet miraculously pure. Try fitting that into a Valentine's card. The charm of this philosophy lay in its contradictions. Lovers were forbidden to touch yet encouraged to burn with longing. They were urged to worship their beloved as an unreachable ideal yet expected to express devotion through gifts and service. It was emotional gymnastics at its finest. The lady was always superior, untouchable, remote, a moral compass cloaked in silk, and the knight's duty was to serve, protect, and suffer nobly in her name. A single smile from her could redeem months of agony. A glance could heal wounds better than any apothecary. One quirky historical tidbit tucked into the margins of Capellanus's text claims that love cannot exist in the heart of a glutton, as if romance required fasting and moral purity to function correctly. So, the next time someone says chivalry is dead, you might remember it once came with dietary restrictions. You can almost see the ritual play out before you. A knight kneels before a lady at a tournament, not asking for her hand in marriage, heaven forbid, but for her permission to wear her favor, perhaps a ribbon or a brooch. She hesitates, glancing toward the watching crowd, then nods faintly, and the entire audience erupts in murmurs because that one gesture has just rewritten weeks of whispered gossip. The knight rides off, risking his life for a symbol that technically means nothing and emotionally means everything. When he wins, he doesn't dare embrace her. Instead, he bows, sweaty and bleeding, as she waves politely from a balcony. It's theater, yes, but it's also survival. The art of turning passion into something safe enough to display but dangerous enough to feel. And yet, beneath the elegance, there's irony. Most marriages among nobles were arranged for politics, not affection. Love, therefore, became an extracurricular activity, an emotional rebellion disguised as refinement. While husbands handled alliances, wives learned poetry and subtle rebellion. Courtly love gave them a stage on which they could feel powerful without overtly defying convention. Scholars still debate whether these relationships were ever consummated or merely symbolic. The eternal academic tug-of-war between cynics who see hypocrisy and romantics who see transcendence. Did they really resist temptation for decades just to keep love pure, or is that what they wanted everyone to believe? There's no single answer. Only the echo of sighs through parchment and time. You drift deeper into the hall, where painted shields gleam under candlelight. Each carries a crest, lions, lilies, crosses, but hidden among them are symbols of love disguised as heraldry. Interlocked rings, pierced hearts, roses carved into the edges. Everything about this culture screams subtlety, as if the whole aristocracy agreed to speak about desire only through metaphors and allegory. It makes you wonder if the constant repression didn't make emotions sharper, more intoxicating. Imagine wanting something so fiercely that you invent an entire social system just to talk about it safely. That's the paradox of the medieval soul. Passion restrained becomes poetry. Yearning denied becomes religion. A soft wind sneaks through the arrow slits of the hall, fluttering banners and cooling the torches. You can almost hear the clink of armor and the rustle of gowns as couples move apart at the approach of the chaplain, pretending to discuss scripture. Everyone is fluent in hypocrisy, but it's the kind that lets love survive under watchful eyes. Capellanus even outlined how to fall out of love properly, slowly, with dignity, and never by confessing boredom. Love dies, he wrote, when it is exposed to too much. Maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. The belief that secrecy is sacred, that mystery itself keeps passion alive. Still, not all hearts obeyed. Some knights and ladies pushed past decorum and paid the price. There are stories, half rumor, half truth, of lovers caught and condemned, of letters discovered in prayer books, of duels fought not for honor but heartbreak. Yet even those tragedies fed the legend, making love seem worth dying for. You can sense how intoxicating it must have felt to risk everything for a glance, a verse, a hidden touch behind a curtain. Every boundary created by the rules only made breaking them more exhilarating. The whole culture functioned like a slow waltz at the edge of scandal, one that could stop abruptly if the wrong person entered the room. Now the hall empties, the echoes of laughter and lute strings fading. You walk past the days where once the courts of love supposedly gathered to judge romantic disputes, real or invented, no one's entirely sure. Maybe they were nothing more than literary parlor games. Maybe they were serious tribunals where women decided matters of the heart like queens of emotional justice. Historians can't quite agree, which is oddly fitting for a system built entirely on ambiguity. The candles burn lower, casting pools of gold across polished stone, and you find yourself smiling at the absurd grandeur of it all. Love is law, desire is diplomacy. What a world to live in. Outside, the night air smells of pine and smoke. Somewhere, an owl hoots, and the castle feels both eternal and fragile. You think about those rules, how every one of them was designed to keep people yearning without breaking the social order, and you realize that in their strange way they succeeded. The world they built still whispers through ours. Every romantic comedy, every secret crush, every text left unsent at midnight owes a debt to those dusty codes written by candlelight. Maybe Capellanus knew exactly what he was doing when he penned those contradictory commandments. He gave humanity permission to love, even when forbidden. And as you step out beneath the medieval stars, you understand why that idea never really died. Because rules, it turns out, are just the scaffolding that keeps passion from burning the whole castle down. The bells of Vespers echo softly through stone cloisters as you wander deeper into the medieval world, and now love no longer hides behind flowers or poetry. It hides from God, or at least from those who claim to speak for him. You can feel the air grow colder as you step into the shadow of the church, where candles flicker like nervous hearts and incense veils the smell of secrecy. The medieval church, ever watchful and endlessly inventive when it came to moral boundaries, built an elaborate system of laws to control who could love whom, when, and how, as if the act of falling for another human being were a kind of spiritual trespass that required confession and sometimes penance. But of course, people are inventive too, and for every rule written by bishops, someone, somewhere, found a loophole. You can almost see them now. Noble women in confessional booths whispering not sins but coded messages, monks carrying letters tucked in psalters, priests secretly blessing marriages the Pope would have outlawed. Love, after all, has never respected borders, not even divine ones. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. By the 12th century, canon law had declared marriage a holy sacrament, meaning that consent, mutual consent between a man and woman, was all that was required for a valid union. They didn't even need witnesses. One yes from each, spoken privately, and boom, legally and spiritually bound. It sounds liberating, doesn't it? But of course it terrified everyone in power, because it meant lovers could marry without their parents' approval, without dowries, without politics, without permission, which is exactly what they did. And that, in turn, led to centuries of clandestine vows whispered in barns, stables, gardens, even graveyards, where the dead at least couldn't gossip. You imagine one of these scenes. A boy barely 20, a girl of 17, their breath turning to fog in the cold air of a winter field, clasping hands as they mutter the words "I take thee," quick and trembling, before running in opposite directions so no one can catch them. It's romantic and reckless and very, very illegal. Church courts spent centuries trying to sort out which marriages were real and which were merely rumors. Some couples exploited the chaos, pretending to be married to avoid sin, then claiming they weren't when the passion faded. Others did the opposite, denying their secret vows when political marriages beckoned. Canon lawyers filled volumes arguing about whether a union could exist without witnesses, without consummation, without parental blessing, or even without sobriety. The result was a theological knot so tangled that it would make any modern lawyer weep with envy. Still, even with all that confusion, the Church maintained a paradoxical power over love. It both condemned and sanctified it. Priests preached that passion outside marriage was a gateway to hell, yet they also called marriage itself a remedy for lust. And then there were the poor souls in monasteries, those who'd taken vows of celibacy, suddenly discovering that the human heart didn't care about rules written in Latin. You hear whispers of monks writing love poetry under the guise of religious devotion, comparing their longing for God to the longing for someone whose name they never wrote. One fringe but well-documented tidbit tells of Marguerite Kempe, an English mystic who in the early 15th century claimed Jesus himself asked her to live in chastity, but she confessed that she still felt great fervor of love for her husband, and sometimes argued with God about whether a kiss counted as sin. That's the medieval mind in a nutshell, caught between heaven and hearth, between doctrine and heartbeat. The Church's obsession with control extended far beyond marriage itself. It policed consanguinity, who was related to whom, and for centuries the definition of too close expanded and contracted, like an accordion of inconvenience. At one point, the forbidden degrees stretched so far that you couldn't marry anyone within 7 generations. Imagine trying to map that out without a family tree app. These laws weren't just moral, they were political, designed to keep noble families from consolidating too much power. Yet somehow love still managed to defy genealogy. You can almost hear a medieval teenager sighing, "But father, she's only my 4th cousin," before being told he'd just doomed his soul. And of course there were the priests and bishops who broke their own vows with astonishing frequency. Illicit romances within monasteries were whispered about constantly, though few dared to record them openly. In one notorious case from 14th century France, a monk was caught sneaking out of his abbey at night to meet a local widow. When questioned, he claimed he was ministering to her spirit. The abbot, unimpressed, sent him to pray in silence for a year. Though rumor had it the widow brought him food the whole time. Scholars still debate how strictly celibacy was enforced, with some arguing that enforcement was more theoretical than practical. Others suggest it depended entirely on the personality of the local bishop. Either way, the tension between passion and piety became one of the defining dramas of medieval life. You picture lovers dodging torches in the dark, hiding behind cloisters and barns, trusting that the same stars shining on cathedrals might forgive what the priests would not. The idea of sin made every touch feel dangerous, and danger, as always, made it more intoxicating. Love was rebellion disguised as faith. People invoked saints to bless their unions, lit candles before icons of the Virgin Mary as though she, above all, might understand the madness of loving in secret. A few even believed that confession could cleanse illicit love, as long as the priest wasn't the one involved. It's both absurd and strangely moving, this constant attempt to thread romance through the needle eye of salvation. The irony deepens when you remember that many of the Church's own leaders wrote about love with startling tenderness. Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance, compared divine love to a kiss of the soul. Hildegard of Bingen wrote mystical visions that sound at times suspiciously like passionate poetry. Even theologians who thundered against desire couldn't quite resist describing it in luminous detail. Maybe they knew that love and faith weren't enemies but siblings, both forms of longing that reach for something beyond themselves. In this world, the line between sacred and profane was as thin as parchment. Lovers borrowed religious language to describe each other, calling their partners angels, saints, even saviors, while the Church used romantic metaphors to describe humanity's bond with God. The same words, amor, caritas, gratia, floated between sermons and sonnets, between altar and bed. You realize that in medieval Europe, love wasn't just an emotion, it was a battlefield between soul and flesh, eternity and instinct, and every lover, no matter how humble, fought on both sides. As you step into the courtyard of this imagined monastery, the moonlight spills across worn stones, and the sound of distant chanting drifts through the air. You feel both awe and melancholy. Here, behind these walls, countless hearts wrestled with impossible choices between duty and desire, salvation and selfhood. Some chose devotion and lived quietly in faith. Others chose passion and vanished into scandal. And most, perhaps, simply lived in the tension, loving as carefully as they could under the watchful gaze of heaven. The bells toll again, softer now, fading into the night. You walk past the cloister garden where roses climb the stone, each thorn a reminder that beauty here always came with risk. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, a pair of lovers might be whispering vows they'll never speak aloud again. Their words rise like smoke, fragile and luminous, disappearing into the stars. And you can't help thinking that if love is a sin, then sin has never smelled so sweet. You wake to the sound of bells again, but this time they're not calling anyone to prayer. They're calling witnesses to a wedding. The courtyard outside the manor hums with chatter, and the smell of freshly baked bread mingles with damp straw and the sharp sweetness of flowers woven into garlands. You blink and realize you're standing in the middle of a medieval marriage day, not one born of passion or secret vows, but of paperwork, politics, and parental negotiation. You can almost hear the quills scratching inside the great hall where the contracts are being finalized. Because in the Middle Ages, falling in love was optional, marriage was business. The concept of romantic choice was about as realistic as flying carpets. A noble family married to preserve bloodlines, secure land, or make peace after a feud. A merchant's daughter married to merge fortunes. A peasant married to survive. And if love somehow sprouted afterward, well, that was a delightful miracle. Like finding a rose growing through cobblestone. A mainstream historical fact here grounds the scene. In most of medieval Europe, marriage wasn't simply a private bond but a social contract negotiated by families, often when the bride and groom were still children. Girls might be betrothed as early as 12, boys at 14, though the Church technically preferred older. Marriages among nobles were political events, announced like treaties sealed by dowries the size of small kingdoms. You can picture it now. A father inspecting a potential son-in-law's lineage like a merchant appraising fine silk, mothers whispering about virtue, and a monk standing by to remind everyone that yes, technically, God should be involved somewhere in this. Meanwhile, the bride sits quietly, hands folded in her lap, her future determined by men who consider her feelings about as relevant as the weather forecast. It's all so rigid, so practical, that it's almost comical, and yet within this framework of formality, something deeply human kept finding ways to bloom. The medieval heart, stubborn as ever, found its cracks to grow through. Sometimes arranged couples did fall genuinely in love. There are letters, rare and hesitant, where husbands wrote to absent wives with surprising tenderness, or where wives prayed daily for their husband's safety during wars they never asked for. Other times they tolerated each other with the endurance of saints, sharing space but not affection, exchanging politeness instead of passion. And sometimes, far more often than anyone admitted, they looked elsewhere for comfort, which is why the church had to keep issuing warnings about adultery with the frequency of weather reports. One fringe tidbit about arranged marriage comes from a chronicler in 13th century England who claimed a certain noblewoman, Lady Juliana, refused to marry the man her parents chose. To punish her, they locked her in a convent for a year, until she agreed. But the story takes a twist. Inside the convent, she met a monk who helped her escape disguised as a novice. The two married in secret, and while no one knows how long their happiness lasted, ballads about the Lady of Locksley were sung for generations. Whether it's true or not hardly matters. The point is, even then, people loved the idea of love breaking the rules. You step closer to the bride now, just as she's being led out of the hall. Her dress is heavy, thickly embroidered, so ornate it seems to weigh her down. A wreath of rosemary crowns her veil. Not for beauty, but for remembrance. A reminder to stay faithful in thought and deed. The groom stands awkwardly beside her, more aware of the watching crowd than of the woman whose hand he now takes. The priest murmurs Latin, but half the guests are too busy whispering about dowry sums and land rights to listen. The couple's eyes meet briefly, a flicker of something uncertain passing between them. Maybe fear, maybe curiosity, maybe the first spark of something that could grow, given time and patience. Because arranged marriages weren't always loveless. They were simply slow. Love here didn't arrive like lightning. It crept in, quiet and deliberate, shaped by routine, shared hardship and the dull comfort of familiarity. Maybe the first real conversation came weeks later, during harvest. Maybe laughter over spilled ale turned strangers into allies. Maybe affection took root not from passion but from survival, the slow realization that partnership, however forced, could still turn into devotion, and when it didn't, people found ways to cope. Jesters joked about it, poets romanticized it, and priests preached endurance as virtue. Still, beneath the solemnity of all this order, you can feel the tension between duty and desire, like two strings pulled too tight on a harp. The system worked on paper, but people were not paper. Even peasants, who had more freedom to choose their partners, faced pressure from parents, lords, and neighbors. A farmer might marry a woman because her family owned the next field over. A widow might marry a blacksmith simply because he could feed her children. Love was practical first, poetic later. You imagine a young couple in a thatched cottage, sharing stale bread and laughter after a long day in the fields, their affection unspoken but solid as the soil beneath them. It's not the romance of troubadours, but it's love all the same, the kind that smells like smoke and hay instead of perfume and parchment. And then there were the high-born unions that made history. Kings and queens trapped in alliances that were less about companionship than about producing heirs. You think of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII, an arranged match that ended in scandal and divorce, paving the way for Eleanor's far more passionate marriage to Henry II. Historians still debate whether her rebellion was a triumph of romance or pure political maneuvering. But either way, she proved that even queens could defy the script. The tension between obligation and emotion runs through every century like a heartbeat that refuses to quiet down. The wedding procession moves toward the church now. The bells ringing louder, the scent of frankincense mixing with rain. Children throw petals, dogs bark, the priest raises his hands, and the vows are spoken carefully, properly, without tremor. For better or worse, though they both know the choice was never really theirs. And yet, as they walk back down the aisle, something changes. The groom steals a glance, the bride's lips twitch into a tiny smile, and for a moment, amid all the ceremony and calculation, the air feels lighter. Maybe it's hope, maybe it's relief, maybe it's love daring to sneak in where it wasn't invited. You follow them outside into the drizzle, where the guests lift cups of wine and cheer. A minstrel strikes up a tune, cheerful but slightly off-key, and laughter ripples through the crowd. The newlyweds disappear into their chamber to seal the contract, but that's another story altogether. You linger by the doorway, watching the rain turn to mist, and realize that medieval marriage was less a union of hearts than a collision of worlds. Family against family, faith against flesh, duty against dream. And yet, against all odds, the human heart kept finding ways to rebel, to soften, to bloom even in captivity. Maybe that's the lesson this strange candlelit century keeps trying to teach, that love doesn't always begin with choice, but it can end with kindness. And sometimes, in a world ruled by bargains, kindness was the most romantic thing of all. You walk away from the manor's courtyard where the echoes of arranged marriages and polite applause fade behind you. And now the night air turns sharp, thrilling, alive with the sound of hooves on gravel and hurried whispers in the dark. This is not the world of sanctioned unions and perfumed dowries. This is the world of rebellion, the realm of lovers who refused to wait for permission, who gambled everything for the chance to say yes on their own terms. You can almost feel their urgency in the wind, a heartbeat beneath the stars as cloaks snap behind galloping horses. It's midnight, the moon barely visible, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows, two figures ride hard toward the edge of a forest, carrying nothing but faith, fear, and a few coins. Because in medieval Europe, eloping wasn't just romantic, it was defiant. It meant challenging fathers, lords, bishops, and sometimes even kings, and if you were caught, you risked excommunication, imprisonment, or at the very least, a family feud that could last generations. But in that fleeting window between the vow and the discovery, it must have felt like freedom itself. The scene plays out vividly before you. A young knight, his armor half-fastened and cloak torn, helping his love climb into the saddle. She's wearing her shift beneath a travel cloak, her hair unbraided for the first time in her life. They speak in whispers that tremble between laughter and panic. "Ride hard," he says. "They'll wake soon." Behind them, in the manor, a servant notices the open gate, the empty chamber, and the abandoned dowry chest, and the chase begins. You can almost hear the barking of hounds, the bells tolling as though the whole village has been summoned to witness this scandalous adventure. And yet, for all the chaos, there's something heartbreakingly pure about it. For once, the lovers aren't playing by anyone's rules, not the church's, not their families, not even society's. They're writing their own story, for however long it lasts. A mainstream historical fact here adds texture. By the 14th century, so many couples were eloping that the church began to crack down, issuing decrees that all marriages must be publicly announced in church 3 times before taking place. These were called bans of marriage. It was an attempt to prevent impulsive unions and hidden vows. But as history proves, people are spectacularly good at ignoring paperwork when their hearts are on fire. Lovers fled to the countryside, to barns, to crossroads, to tiny chapels where sympathetic priests could be bribed with a few coins and a promise of discretion. One of the most famous havens for elopement centuries later, Gretna Green on the English-Scottish border, was simply an echo of this much older tradition of running for love. Medieval couples called it marriage by consent, whispering the required words, "I take thee," and sealing it with a kiss or the joining of hands. It didn't need a ring or witnesses, it only needed courage and mutual will. And here comes the quirky tidbit. In some regions, lovers would swear their vows at crossroads or under certain trees believed to be sacred. thinking that natural witnesses, oak, ash, and yew, were enough to sanctify the bond. In Wales, folklore speaks of handfasting rituals, where couples tied their hands together with ribbon or cord and pledged themselves for a year and a day. If after that time they still wished to remain together, they renewed their vows. If not, they parted without shame. Imagine that level of flexibility in an age obsessed with permanence. The Church naturally called it scandalous, but it persisted for centuries among common folk who valued love's choice over law's command. Scholars still debate whether these ceremonies were legally binding or merely symbolic, but for those who took part, they felt as real as any altar-bound blessing. You picture one of those secret unions now. The lovers dismount near an abandoned chapel at the edge of the woods. The door creaks open, revealing an old monk half asleep by the hearth, his eyes narrowing when he sees them. "Please," the girl says, "we just need your blessing." The monk sighs, the eternal sigh of someone who knows he shouldn't but will. He mumbles Latin, barely audible over the crackle of fire, and ties a scrap of linen around their joined hands. No witnesses, no music, no fanfare, just the smell of smoke, the tremor of breath, and the knowledge that they've crossed a line they can never uncross. Outside, the wind howls through the trees as if the whole world has agreed to keep their secret, and for a moment they believe it. But the road of elopement rarely ends in peace. Some couples were caught and dragged home, their vows annulled by furious parents. Others made it to distant villages where they lived quietly under new names, blending into the rhythm of peasant life. A few, astonishingly, managed to reconcile with their families once tempers cooled, especially if the runaway union turned profitable or politically convenient later on. Still, the stain of scandal lingered. Chroniclers often described eloped brides as fallen, as if love chosen freely were somehow dirtier than love arranged by contract. Yet, when you read between the lines of those moralizing records, you sense envy, the quiet fascination of writers who secretly admired the courage it took to choose passion over propriety. The moon rises higher, casting silver light on the road ahead. You follow the lovers as they disappear into the forest, their path lit only by faith and the occasional flicker of a torch. Every sound feels amplified: the hoot of an owl, the crunch of leaves, the distant splash of a stream. The air smells of moss and horse sweat and adrenaline. There's something cinematic about it all, as though the entire medieval world were holding its breath to see if they'll make it. You know the odds are against them. You know the church and family law will hunt them down. And yet part of you wants to believe they'll vanish into legend, that centuries later people will still whisper about the knight and the maiden who escaped by moonlight. Love in this era was rarely kind to rebels. Elopers faced not only punishment but damnation. The church taught that secret vows without witnesses invited the devil himself to meddle. But maybe that's what made these stories endure. The sense that love to be real must risk something holy. Every age needs its rebels, and these two, galloping through the dark, are as brave as any warrior. Their victory isn't measured in longevity or legality, it's measured in the brief, incandescent truth of choosing each other despite the world's disapproval. As dawn breaks, you see them reach a small clearing. The sky blushes pink over the horizon, and they stop to rest by a stream. He removes his glove and brushes a strand of hair from her cheek. She laughs a small, unguarded sound, and suddenly all the fear, all the danger, feels worth it. They don't know what tomorrow will bring, but for now they are free. And as you watch them vanish down the road toward whatever fate awaits, you realize something quietly universal. Love has always been an act of faith, but in the Middle Ages it was also an act of rebellion. Every secret vow, every midnight escape, every whispered "I take thee," was a small miracle carved against the granite face of tradition. And even if those vows were forgotten by history, the courage behind them still hums faintly in the air like hooves on an endless road that never quite fades away. You stand beneath a medieval night sky, an enormous dome of stars so bright it almost seems alive, and you realize that to fall in love in this age meant also falling under the gaze of the heavens. The stars were not distant fires, they were storytellers, whispering destinies in coded constellations, shaping who you loved when you met, and whether your union would bless or doom you. In a world with no psychology, no algorithms, and very little privacy, astrology was the ultimate dating app, part cosmic calendar, part divine matchmaking service. Every noble household had its chart. Every birth was logged by hour and minute, and every priest with a decent grasp of Latin and geometry fancied himself an interpreter of fate. To the medieval mind, love was not random. It was written, and if you found yourself hopelessly smitten, you could always blame Venus. You imagine a young woman leaning from her balcony, her hair glinting in moonlight, whispering to a friend, "He was born under Aries, of course he's rash," as if that excused everything from dueling to forgetting her birthday. In candlelit chambers, astrologers unrolled vast charts, their fingers tracing planetary paths with the gravity of surgeons. A mainstream historical fact helps anchor this wonder. By the 13th century, universities like Paris and Bologna formally taught astrology as a respected science, often practiced by scholars who doubled as physicians. Love, health, and destiny were inseparable. If Mars dominated your chart, you were passionate but dangerous. If Saturn ruled, you were devoted but doomed to melancholy. The Church officially frowned upon predicting the future, yet bishops quietly commissioned charts for their nephews' marriages. Hypocrisy, it seems, is older than the stars themselves. You picture one of those astrologers. Now, a wiry man hunched over parchment in a tower, calculating with trembling hands the exact hour a lady should accept a suitor's letter. He squints at the stars through a brass astrolabe, muttering about conjunctions and houses, while the lovers below wait anxiously for his verdict. Venus ascends through Taurus, he declares, favorable for affection, but beware Mercury in retrograde. The phrase means nothing to them but sounds ominous enough to inspire caution, and so they delay their meeting a week, because if there's one thing scarier than love in the Middle Ages, it's defying cosmic timing. Then, there's the quirky tidbit you can't help smiling at. In some corners of Europe, astrologers were hired to determine the most auspicious night for a wedding, not by checking the weather, but by calculating the couple's combined star charts. If Mars and Venus were aligned, the marriage promised passion. If Jupiter favored the union, it foretold prosperity. But if Saturn sat heavy in the 7th house, well, better postpone the feast. Chroniclers tell of nobles delaying weddings for months to avoid malignant constellations. Imagine explaining to your guests that the stars rescheduled your big day. Of course, this obsession with celestial matchmaking had its skeptics even then. Scholarly debate raged across abbeys and courts. Were the stars divine messengers or just convenient scapegoats for human folly? Thomas Aquinas himself wrestled with the idea, conceding that stars might influence temperament but not free will. A very polite medieval way of saying you can't blame Venus for your bad decisions. But ordinary people didn't care about theological nuance. They watched the sky the way modern lovers watch their phones, desperate for signs. A falling star could mean luck in love, a comet disaster, and eclipses. Those dark, trembling moments when the moon swallowed the sun terrified everyone. Some believed they marked the end of forbidden affairs, others that they ignited new ones. You imagine a clandestine meeting beneath such a sky. A knight, freshly returned from campaign, finds his beloved in a garden lit by a pale crescent moon. She's trembling, not from fear, but from the sense that the entire universe is listening. He tells her the stars have changed since he left, that Venus now rides higher, that their fates are finally aligned. It's nonsense, of course, but beautiful nonsense, and in this world beauty often matters more than truth. They kiss beneath the yew tree, believing for one breathless instant that their souls are written in the same constellation. What's remarkable is how the medieval imagination fused astrology and religion without seeing a contradiction. God ruled heaven, yes, but the stars were his instruments, celestial bureaucrats carrying out divine paperwork. Even monks studied planetary tables to time their prayers, and physicians prescribed treatments according to zodiac signs. A lover's melancholy might be cured not by confession but by wearing a ruby when Venus was in Libra. It sounds ridiculous now, but when medicine, magic, and faith all shared a vocabulary, this made perfect sense. People wanted to believe that love followed a rhythm larger than themselves, that every heartbreak and miracle had a cosmic logic. You stroll farther into this imagined night, feeling the chill deepen. The constellations above seem enormous, almost personal. The Great Bear turns. Orion leans on his belt, and Cassiopeia glitters like a jeweled crown. You realize that for the medieval lover, the night sky wasn't distant, it was intimate, a map of human feeling reflected back in light years. Every bright point was a story, every alignment a possibility. The astrologer's parchment, smudged with ink and candle wax, was simply a mirror of the heart, messy, hopeful, imperfect, endlessly revised. And maybe, you think, they weren't so wrong. The language of the stars gave people permission to dream beyond their station, to imagine that a farmer's daughter could love a nobleman if only their horoscopes agreed, that destiny might favor the bold if Venus smiled. It turned longing into mathematics and heartbreak into poetry. Even today, when we laugh at horoscopes, we still secretly glance at them, still whisper, maybe it's written. That's the echo of medieval starlight still shimmering through us, faint but persistent, like the afterglow of a candle long extinguished but not forgotten. You stand now at the edge of dawn. The stars fade, the air warms, and a rooster crows somewhere in the valley below. The astrologer in his tower snuffs his candle, satisfied or perhaps just tired. The lovers beneath him part ways before sunrise, promising to meet again when the heavens permit. The charts, the predictions, the cosmic drama, all dissolve with the coming day, leaving only one undeniable truth: people have always searched for patterns to make sense of love's chaos. Whether in stars or sermons, in charts or chance encounters, the hope remains the same, that the universe, vast and indifferent though it seems, might still be quietly conspiring to bring two souls together beneath its endless sky. You wander now into the smoky half-light of a medieval market, where reason and superstition mingle as easily as herbs in a mortar. The air smells of crushed sage, rose petals, and suspicion. Women in heavy cloaks trade bundles of plants tied with twine, and every whisper seems to promise the same thing: hope bottled in secret, because when prayers failed, when courtly codes collapsed, when even the stars grew silent, people turned to magic, and love, being the most unpredictable force of all, inspired some of the strangest potions ever brewed. You hear the rattle of glass vials and the bubbling of cauldrons, and the question hangs in the air: can desire be distilled? In this world, the boundary between medicine and magic barely existed. Apothecaries, wise women, and traveling friars all sold remedies that might heal a wound or capture a heart, depending on how you asked. A mainstream historical fact anchors the fantasy: medieval herbals, those illustrated plant manuals copied in monasteries, recorded dozens of recipes labeled as philtra, or love filters. Some used ordinary ingredients like basil, honey, or violet root. Others reached for the grotesque powdered bat wings, toad livers, and the occasional drop of moon water, which was either dew collected at midnight or, well, something less poetic. These concoctions promised everything from making someone notice you to forcing eternal devotion, though the results were, shall we say, inconsistent. You picture a girl of 17 buying a vial from a hooded woman near the town gate. She clutches it like a holy relic, her palms slick with nerves. 3 drops in wine, the seller murmurs. No more. The girl nods, half terrified, half thrilled. Back home, she hides the vial behind a prayer candle, waiting for the next feast when she might slip it into her beloved's cup. Whether it works or not hardly matters. Belief is its own kind of alchemy. But it's easy to see how these things got out of hand. There's a record from 1322 of a French servant tried for bewitching her master's affection with herbs steeped in menstrual blood. Another from Florence mentions a monk who confessed to using Venus water to inflame a woman's heart. He was sentenced to 40 days of fasting, which probably did more for his complexion than his conscience. And yet, not all charms were sinister. Many were simple gestures of faith, wearing a token blessed on St. Agnes's Day, carving a lover's name on apple bark, or carrying a piece of coral to ward off envy. The Church alternated between condemning and quietly tolerating these practices, depending on how pagan they looked. Clerics railed against love magic in sermons, calling it the devil's counterfeit of divine affection, but peasants saw no contradiction in lighting candles to both saints and spirits. It's one of history's ongoing debates, whether these spells were early psychology, a way to feel some control in a world where love and fate seemed cruelly random. Perhaps the potion mattered less than the ritual, the grinding of herbs, the whispered prayer, the sense that you were doing something, anything, to make someone see you. A fringe tidbit glimmers among the folklore. Medieval lovers sometimes baked charms into bread or cakes, hiding tiny tokens, bits of hair, fingernails or initials scratched on lead discs so that whoever ate them would consume affection itself. It's horrifying and oddly poetic, like a love letter you could digest. Others wore amulets containing dried hearts of doves or painted sigils invoking Venus and Cupid. The wealthy could afford more elaborate magic rings engraved with astrological symbols, necklaces filled with perfumed resins blessed under certain moons. For everyone else, there were prayers disguised as spells. May your eyes turn always toward mine. May your dreams carry my name. And perhaps the greatest magic of all was that sometimes, inexplicably, these charms seemed to work. You step into a dim hut now, where an old woman grinds something that smells faintly of cloves and regret. She hums under her breath, a tune older than Latin, older than sin. Bottles line the walls, some labeled with careful script, others scrawled in symbols no scholar could decipher. She glances up, her eyes bright and amused. You seek to make someone love you, she asks, or to make them stop. You don't answer, because in truth both are the same kind of spell. She chuckles, pours liquid into a small clay flask, and hands it to you. Remember, she says, the strongest potion is the one that doesn't need to be drunk. Outside, the sky bruises with twilight. You hold the flask, feeling its warmth fade in your palm, and you realize how timeless this longing is. Even now, centuries later, people still look for shortcuts to connection. Apps, formulas, love languages, each one a modern charm promising to tame the wild heart. The medieval potion makers simply made the metaphor literal. Love, they believed, was a fire in the blood, and every fire, if mixed correctly, could be controlled. But deep down, they must have known the truth. No charm could force real affection, only mimic it. That was the cruel trick of magic. It gave hope where honesty could not. As you walk through the market one last time, the wind carries scents of myrrh, lavender, and smoke. Somewhere, a lute player sings a soft ballad about a night bewitched by a maiden's eyes. The melody rises above the murmurs of buyers and sellers, a reminder that love, whether born of spells or sincerity, has always danced between danger and wonder. You set the potion down on a stone wall, watching the cork glint in the last light of sunset. The liquid inside seems to shimmer like molten amber, and as the night creeps in, you can't help smiling because maybe, just maybe, the only true enchantment was never in the bottle at all, but in the act of believing that love somehow could still be conjured. The candlelight has softened. The market has faded, and you find yourself in a great hall filled with laughter, dice, and the sound of music echoing off stone. Gone is the hush of monasteries and secret chapels. Now, love is a performance, a game, literally. Because in the late Middle Ages, flirtation was not just tolerated at court. It was ritualized, rehearsed, and celebrated as an art form. You can almost smell the sweet mead and the faint tang of waxed floors as couples glide between tables, whispering double meanings behind fans and goblets. Every glance is a gamble, every word a move in a game older than chess. You stand among them, the hum of human drama buzzing in your ears, and realize that while war and famine shaped the world outside, here inside, people fought different battles, quiet duels of affection, wit, and patience. Flirtation in this era had rules almost as intricate as those of combat. Nobles didn't simply flirt. They engaged in structured games of love that could last hours or even days. A mainstream historical fact sets the stage. At courts like that of Eleanor of Aquitaine or Burgundy's Philip the Good, courts of love were not only theoretical, they were social salons where noble ladies judged questions of romance, such as whether a married woman could love someone other than her husband, or whether jealousy was proof of devotion. These debates were conducted with mock seriousness, presided over like trials. You watch as a knight approaches a lady seated beneath a tapestry. He bows, not too low, humility is unflattering, and begins the opening move. "My lady, if your eyes be the sun, then all the candles here should hide in shame." She laughs, deflecting. "Then perhaps you should hide too, for you've melted faster than wax." The crowd roars with amusement. It's all harmless play, yet it pulses with tension. These games allowed what reality forbade: intimacy without consequence, passion disguised as poetry. The room becomes a theater where everyone plays a role. The gallant knight, the coy maiden, the wise widow, the cynical jester who mocks them all. A quirky historical tidbit floats in like perfume. Some noble courts hosted Valentine's Day lotteries, long before Hallmark ever existed. Names were drawn at random, pairing men and women as symbolic valentines for the year. They exchanged small gifts, ribbons, tokens, or even poems, and were expected to praise one another in public. The relationships could be platonic or dangerously not. One record from 15th century France describes a lady who received a golden heart from her Valentine and promptly caused scandal by wearing it every day for 3 years. Another woman, less subtle, had her chosen knight's initials embroidered inside her sleeve, where only he would ever see them. Scholars still argue whether these customs were innocent entertainment or thinly veiled pretexts for adultery. The answer, of course, depends on who's telling the story. The games themselves were endless. The apple game, where a lady tossed a fruit to a suitor and challenged him to rhyme on the spot. The chain game, where participants had to name virtues of love until someone faltered and owed a forfeit, usually a kiss. Even dances were coded conversations. During the carol, partners circled hand in hand, eyes locked just long enough to set tongues wagging. At feasts, people carved messages into bread crusts or scratched initials into goblets. And through all of it, decorum demanded that everyone pretend it meant nothing. That was the real trick of medieval flirtation: to burn with feeling and never let it show, at least not entirely. There's a strange poignancy beneath the laughter. These flirtations were often the only freedom aristocratic women possessed, their one way to express wit and agency in a society that prized silence. Within the safety of the game, they could reject, tease, even humiliate men who otherwise commanded armies. "The lady's word is law," said the poets, and in these moments it truly was. Yet the same courtly theater that empowered them also confined them. A misjudged glance, a rumor too easily believed, could destroy reputations overnight. That's the paradox. Love was exalted as pure and ennobling, yet the women who embodied it walked a tightrope over ruin. You can almost see it unfolding. A hall glowing with candlelight, musicians plucking lutes, laughter rippling like silk. A young squire loses a game of truth or forfeit, and kneels to recite a verse he clearly didn't write himself. The lady smiles indulgently. Someone starts a round of If Love Were a Bird, a parlor game in which each player invents a metaphor for love. A hawk untamed, a caged dove, a falcon that bites the hand that feeds it. Each answer reveals more than intended, and everyone knows it. Beneath the games, hearts tremble, but the rules must be obeyed. To love without restraint was vulgar. To love skillfully, elegantly, hopelessly, that was art. The church, of course, disapproved. Monks wrote furious sermons about these gatherings, calling them devil's banquets, yet the clergy's protests only made them more alluring. If sin had a scent, it would have been spiced wine and beeswax, the perfume of forbidden joy. You wonder, as you listen to the music fade, whether anyone ever dropped the mask, whether a knight ever confessed his love outside the game, or a lady ever stopped playing and said simply, "Stay." If they did, history seldom recorded it. Theirs was a world where desire had to hide in riddles, where a single sentence could carry the weight of a lifetime's longing. The torches gutter low now, the laughter thinning to murmurs. You stand in the aftermath among scattered petals and empty cups, thinking how human it all feels, how the urge to flirt, to test affection, to turn love into play still survives. The props have changed, text messages, emojis, inside jokes, but the rhythm is the same. We still measure attraction by wit, still hide behind games because honesty feels too raw. The medieval hall fades, but the echo of laughter remains, warm and wistful. And you realize that for all their rules and rituals, those long-ago players understood something timeless, that love, at its sweetest, has always been a game no one really wants to win. You awaken to the sound of hooves clattering against stone, the rhythmic jingle of chainmail, and the deep thud of a lance being lowered in salute. Dawn spills over a field outside a castle, turning the world gold and gray. You blink, and you're in another layer of the medieval story, the one where love isn't whispered in corners or coated in flowers, but shouted from battlements and sealed in blood. This is the realm of knights, banners and vows, where love and honor are tangled so tightly that to break one is to wound the other. You can smell the iron in the air, the faint sweat of horses, the mingled scent of mud, leather and wild flowers crushed beneath hooves. And at the heart of all this grandeur lies something both absurd and beautiful, the idea that a man could prove his love not by tenderness but by battle. Chivalry, that glittering code of medieval conduct, was more than manners. It was a lifestyle religion. It told knights how to fight, how to serve, and, most confusingly, how to love. A mainstream historical fact anchors this shining illusion. By the 12th century, chivalry had evolved from a military ethic into a moral and romantic one, shaped by writers like Chrétien de Troyes and Geoffroy de Charny, who insisted that a true knight's strength came not just from his sword arm, but from his purity of heart. Love, in this worldview, wasn't weakness, it was discipline. To serve a lady faithfully, without hope of reward, without lust or selfishness, made a man nobler. In short, the more impossible the love, the purer the devotion. It's a philosophy that sounds inspiring in poems and disastrous in real life. You imagine a knight riding into a tournament, his armor gleaming, carrying a lady's ribbon tied to his lance. The crowd cheers as he lowers it, not toward an enemy, but toward the symbol of his affection. She sits in a balcony high above, her veil fluttering in the wind, smiling just enough to keep his heart from shattering. Every blow he lands in the arena, every bruise he earns, is dedicated to her unseen approval. The irony is rich. He fights to the death to prove how gentle his soul is. Chivalric love was built on paradox, brutality as worship, distance as devotion. It's no wonder so many troubadours went insane. A quirky tidbit hides in this world of polished armor and poetic agony. Some knights actually kept miniature portraits or locks of hair in lockets beneath their breastplates, right next to the heart. It's both touching and slightly impractical. If the armor didn't stop a blade, the memento certainly wouldn't. Yet for these warriors, sentiment was protection of a different kind. Love gave them courage, focus, something worth dying for. One chronicler even records a knight in the 14th century who refused to surrender in battle until his opponent agreed to carry a message of devotion to his lady. He died smiling, believing that his last words would cross the miles like a prayer. Whether she ever received them, no one knows. But his story became legend. The tension between love and duty haunted every knightly heart. The church demanded chastity. The code demanded passion. Kings demanded loyalty. Ladies demanded secrecy. You can see why medieval men prayed so often. It wasn't piety so much as exhaustion. Scholars still debate whether the ideals of chivalric love were ever meant to be lived, or were purely literary, a kind of social theater designed to civilize violence through romance. Perhaps the answer is that it didn't matter. Belief itself gave shape to behavior. Even if no knight ever truly lived the perfect blend of lover, saint, and soldier, the dream of it tamed 1,000 swords. You walk among the tents after the tournament now. The field littered with broken lances and ribbons stained with dust. Knights sit by campfires, nursing bruises and reciting poetry they barely understand. One man pulls a crumpled letter from his pouch, a note from a lady who thanks him for his devotion but reminds him politely that she is married. He sighs, folds it carefully, and tucks it back over his heart. The firelight dances in his eyes, a mix of pride and pain. What strikes you most is how performative it all is, how love in this world became theater for the soul. Men cried publicly, wrote poetry, wore women's colors, and called it strength. Women, for their part, wielded silence like a weapon, granting or withholding favor with calculated grace. Every interaction was charged with symbolism. A glance could knight or destroy. A smile could bless or banish. Chivalry made emotion visible, giving form to feelings that might otherwise have vanished in the mud of daily life. Perhaps that's why it lasted so long, not because it was realistic, but because it made life feel grand. The night deepens, and the sounds of the camp fade to the low murmur of prayer and song. Somewhere, a knight kneels beside his sword, pressing his forehead to the hilt. He whispers the same words countless others have spoken before him. For her honor, and for my soul. You wonder if he knows that centuries later, his vow will echo through novels and films, that the image of the noble warrior serving an untouchable love will survive longer than any fortress he ever defended. There's something both tragic and comforting in that the idea that chivalry, for all its contradictions, kept the world dreaming. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of crushed grass and dying fire. You glance up at the stars, the same ones that once watched over Lancelot, Roland, Tristan. The banners above the camp flap softly, their colors faded by moonlight but still defiant. Somewhere beyond the field, the lady in the tower closes her shutters, unaware that entire legends are being written in her name. And you stand there, surrounded by the ghosts of knights and poets, realizing that every time someone still promises to fight for love, to protect it, to prove it, the code in some quiet way still lives. The clang of swords fades behind you, replaced by the low rhythmic chanting of monks. You walk beneath an arched stone passageway into a monastery garden fragrant with mint, lavender, and quiet. Here, love wears a different disguise. It whispers beneath vows of silence, hides in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, and hums faintly between the lines of psalms. The air smells of parchment and candle wax, of wet earth and confession. You hear the steady scrape of quills and the rustle of habits, and for a moment you almost believe this is a place untouched by desire, until you notice how every lock has a key, and every vow, no matter how holy, has a heartbeat behind it. The medieval church demanded abstinence from its clergy and devotion only to God. But the human spirit, unpredictable as ever, found ways to love even within cloisters. A mainstream historical fact grounds the paradox. By the 13th century, monastic communities across Europe were sprawling centers of culture, wealth, and education, but also, quietly, of scandal. Priests fathered children, abbesses exchanged gifts with bishops, and some convents became notorious for what one chronicler politely called worldly friendships. In England alone, church courts recorded dozens of cases of clerics accused of keeping women in their houses, which is a delicate medieval way of saying the celibacy thing didn't stick. You imagine a monastery at twilight, the monks walking in procession, candles trembling in the wind. In one cell, a young brother copies a psalm by hand, his ink-stained fingers trembling not from devotion but from memory. Earlier that day he met a woman from the nearby village, a widow who came seeking a blessing. He spoke kindly, too kindly, and now her eyes linger in his mind, more radiant than any vision of the Virgin Mary. He tries to pray it away, but every letter he writes curves into her name. Across the valley, in a convent, a nun kneels before her candle and recites the rosary. Yet between each bead she thinks of the priest who hears her confessions, the one whose voice sounds like forgiveness and temptation braided together. You realize, walking among them, that these aren't villains or hypocrites, they're simply people caught between duty and longing. They've renounced the world but not the body, and the body has a way of reminding them that it still exists. A fringe but fascinating tidbit survives in the records of a 14th century abbess named Agnes of Prague, who wrote letters so passionately devoted to Christ that some historians argue they border on romantic love poetry. "He has touched me with the fire of his mouth," she wrote, which would raise a few eyebrows in any century. And she wasn't alone. Mystics like Mechthild of Magdeburg describe divine union in language that modern readers can only call sensual. Scholars still debate whether this was spiritual metaphor or sublimated desire. But perhaps the distinction never mattered. Love, whether human or divine, always seeks embodiment. It wants to be felt, not merely imagined. Of course, some affairs were far less symbolic. Convents occasionally doubled as social prisons for noble daughters whose families couldn't find husbands. These women, clever and restless, found ways to reclaim a little life. A visiting monk, a sympathetic confessor, a gardener with kind eyes. There were endless possibilities for what the chroniclers called temptation. One French document from 1298 complains about nuns who dance and sing with clerks, wear their veils carelessly, and make eyes at the townsmen through the cloister gate. You can almost hear the exasperated bishop dictating it, pen scraping furiously, while somewhere nearby a nun giggles behind her sleeve. You step into a scriptorium. Now, the heart of the monastery. The air hums with concentration. A monk illuminates a manuscript, drawing delicate vines in gold leaf that twist around words about purity and sacrifice. Look closer. Hidden among the vines a tiny painted heart, a pair of initials entwined, barely visible to anyone who isn't searching. The secret lives of holy men and women were written not in open scandal but in these quiet gestures, small rebellions against perfection. To live without love entirely, they knew, was to live half dead. One peculiar case from medieval Spain records a monk who confessed to writing poetry for a lady and delivering it disguised as psalms. His punishment was mild. A week of fasting, perhaps because even his abbot couldn't help admiring the creativity. Another record tells of a nun who exchanged letters with a knight through the grille of the convent chapel. When caught, she claimed they were discussing theology. That defense has probably survived more lovers than any charm or potion. But perhaps the most haunting story is that of Heloise and Peter Abelard. the philosopher and his student, whose forbidden love became legend. They met in 12th century Paris, their passion blazing so brightly it scandalized the church. When Abelard was castrated by Heloise's furious uncle, the Middle Ages had a flair for drama. She took the veil and he became a monk. Yet they continued to write to each other for decades, their letters alternating between theology and heartbreak. God knows, she wrote, I would rather be damned with you than saved with all the saints. That line alone could ignite 1,000 torches in the darkness. You wander back into the monastery courtyard now, where the sky is fading from purple to black. Somewhere a bell tolls for Compline, and the monks shuffle silently toward prayer. The scent of incense fills the air, sweet, heavy, faintly intoxicating. You realize that the same smoke rising toward heaven also hides secrets beneath it. These people weren't villains breaking vows. They were proof that love, like water, finds its way through the smallest cracks, even in stone walls built to contain it. As the last light dies, you glance toward a distant window where a single candle still burns. Maybe it's a monk still copying scripture. Maybe it's a nun still awake, writing something she'll burn before dawn. The candle flickers once, twice, and steadies. The chant rises again, low, sorrowful, and beautiful, and you understand that in the great monastery of the world, even holiness hums with hunger. And sometimes that hunger, disguised as prayer, is simply love refusing to die. The chanting fades, and you step once more into the living, breathing world beyond monastery walls. The air tastes of rain and wood smoke. Bells echo faintly over the roofs of a bustling medieval town, and as you wander through the narrow streets, you can feel something lighter in the air, a subtle quickening, an undercurrent of laughter. It's evening, and couples linger in doorways and corners, faces half hidden by candlelight and hoods. Somewhere, someone is kissing someone, very quietly, as though they're performing an act of rebellion too small for history to notice. Because in the Middle Ages, kissing wasn't simply affection, it was theology, politics, and poetry all rolled into one dangerous, delightful act. The world you've been walking through was obsessed with rules. Rules for marriage, rules for prayer, rules for breathing. It sometimes seems, and yet when lips met lips, all those rules blurred into something far older than law. Still, society tried its best to categorize even this most human gesture. A mainstream historical fact sets the tone. By the 12th century, theologians and poets alike had written about at least 3 distinct types of kiss: the holy kiss, shared in peace among the faithful; the feudal kiss, sworn as a bond of loyalty; and the courtly kiss, which, predictably, caused the most trouble. In royal ceremonies, vassals kissed their lord's hand or cheek as a sign of allegiance. At church, worshippers kissed relics, icons, and each other's shoulders in symbolic brotherhood. But when lovers began using the gesture for their own purposes, it became something far less controllable and far more dangerous. You can almost see it now, a knight returning from crusade, kneeling to greet his lady, pressing his lips to her hand in the proper pious way. But then she bends, just slightly, and what should have been a bow of loyalty turns suddenly into something else, something electric, unscripted. The troubadours sang of this very moment, calling it the baiser courtois, the courtly kiss, the instant when devotion tipped over into desire. It was both beautiful and terrifying, because a kiss could mean everything or nothing, a promise or a sin. The church didn't quite know what to do with it. One monk, writing in the 13th century, warned that a single kiss could open the door to damnation, which feels like an overreaction until you remember that medieval people took their metaphors literally. Still, people kissed anyway. They kissed behind tapestry curtains, in gardens, under bridges, in corners of feasts, and sometimes, scandalously, in public. Chroniclers from France to Italy mention dances, ending with ritualized kisses, tokens of courtesy, they called them, though everyone knew courtesy had little to do with it. Even hand-kissing carried subtext. If the lips lingered too long, it was practically a declaration of war on modesty. The word osculum, Latin for kiss, appears in sermons more often than you'd expect, usually accompanied by warnings that the devil loves to hide between mouths. Yet for all the fear, kisses found their way into every layer of medieval life. Lovers, friends, kings, priests, all used them, each claiming different motives. There's a quirky tidbit that makes you laugh. In certain medieval courts, there were kissing customs designed to test character. At feasts, a new guest might be invited to kiss every lady present as a show of goodwill, a tradition that sounds festive until you realize how much it blurred the line between ceremony and flirtation. Some towns even passed kissing taxes, where peasants paid fines for being caught in unseasonable embraces during daylight hours. You can almost picture a flustered official trying to explain why kissing under the moon was acceptable but kissing near the mill was not. Humans have always been inventive when regulating joy, but the kiss also became a tool of narrative and myth. In the legends of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde, a single kiss transforms loyalty into ruin and turns knights into exiles. The power of that gesture haunted Europe for centuries, proof that love could dismantle kingdoms faster than any sword. Artists carved scenes of kisses into cathedral stonework, half reverent, half cautionary. One sculpture in Chartres Cathedral even shows Judas betraying Christ with a kiss, the purest act twisted into treachery, as if the entire continent were wrestling with what this simple human contact truly meant. You pause near a tavern doorway. Inside, a pair of young lovers sit close on a bench, their fingers brushing but not quite daring more. It's a familiar tension, centuries old. A troubadour plays softly in the corner, singing a ballad about a kiss stolen in springtime and punished in confession. The melody drifts through the open shutters, mixing with the scent of ale and rosemary smoke. You realize that for all the sermons and laws, kissing survived because it was communication in its purest form, a language no authority could outlaw. When lips met, words didn't matter. Truth passed directly from one heart to another. Scholars still debate whether medieval kisses were acts of passion or politeness, but perhaps that ambiguity was the point. The mystery kept desire alive. A kiss could seal a marriage, begin an affair, or end a life, yet it remained the same gesture in all three cases. There's something almost magical about that, the way one simple act could contain so much contradiction. It was affection disguised as rebellion, purity pretending to be sin, eternity packed into a heartbeat. As you step back into the street, the night hums around you. Somewhere bells toll again, marking another hour lost to time. The lovers in the tavern laugh quietly. Their shadows merge on the wall. You think of every kiss that came before this one, from feudal halls to cloisters, from battlefields to bridges, each a small defiance against loneliness. And you realize, smiling faintly, that for all its danger and theology, the medieval kiss was something deeply, stubbornly human. It was proof that even in an age obsessed with control, people still found moments to forget the rules and remember how alive it felt just to touch. The town is awake again, but this time it hums not with prayer or duty, it thrums with laughter, drum beats, and the clang of tankards. It's festival day, and for once no one cares who loves whom. The banners flutter, fires crackle, and the air smells gloriously of roast meat, honeyed wine, and wood smoke. You step into the crowd, swept along by the rhythm of drums and bells. Peasants and nobles alike dance shoulder to shoulder, skirts twirling, boots pounding, coins flashing in the sun. It's as if the entire medieval world has decided, just for today, to forget its rules and drown its worries in celebration. And under this cloak of revelry, love has never been bolder. Feasts and festivals were the great social equalizers of the Middle Ages. The church might preach restraint and the nobility might enforce decorum, But when the feast days came, Easter, May Day, Pentecost, Midsummer, the barriers blurred. A mainstream historical fact gives this chaos its frame. Nearly one-third of the medieval calendar was marked by religious holidays, and most of them included some form of communal feasting, dancing, or theatrical play. That meant 1 in every 3 days was an opportunity for someone to flirt under the guise of faith. You can almost see it. Torches flaring in the dusk, musicians striking up a tune, young people circling a maypole draped in flowers, eyes darting and hands brushing by accident. The medieval mind loved symbolism, and these gatherings overflowed with it. In spring festivals, girls wove garlands and placed them on the doorsteps of their favorite boys. On Midsummer's Eve, bonfires burned to purify the air, and lovers leapt through the flames hand in hand, believing it would bind their fates. May Day, the most famous of all, was practically a medieval Valentine's Day. Villagers rose before dawn to fetch the May, cutting branches of hawthorn and decorating homes and wells before the dancing began. The dances themselves, though officially innocent, were anything but. Couples paired off in the fields, music echoing into the woods, and if someone didn't return until morning, well, that was between them and their confessor. Chroniclers scolded endlessly about unseemly conduct among the mayors, but somehow the tradition never stopped. A particularly quirky tidbit sparkles here. In 14th century England, church officials complained that on St. Valentine's Day, unmarried men and women would choose Valentines by lot, exchanging gifts and promises that sometimes lasted a year, or until the next Valentine's Day rolled around. In Paris, the poet Christine de Pizan described these liaisons as noble games of love, that when played honorably were almost a form of courtship training. Of course, played honorably was doing a lot of heavy lifting there. By nightfall, even the holiest feast could turn into a carnival of masks, riddles, and risky dares. You push through the crowd toward a long trestle table where nobles and peasants alike eat from trenchers of bread piled high with meat. There's no silver here, only laughter. A minstrel plays a lute near the wine casks, singing about a baker who fell in love with a nun. Someone shouts for a toast. Another voice replies with a bawdy rhyme. The boundaries between flirtation and foolishness dissolve. Men carve hearts into apples and toss them to women passing by. Women tie ribbons around men's wrists for luck. There's something deliciously democratic about it all. Love not as sacred ordeal or secret sin, but as a shared joke, a communal rhythm. In a corner, a troupe of actors performs a fablio, a comic play about a wife who tricks her jealous husband. The crowd roars, half scandalized, half delighted. The moral, if there is one, seems to be that love always outsmarts control. You realize that these festivals were more than parties. They were pressure valves for an age ruled by restraint. For one day, people could laugh at their own longing, mock the nobles, tease the priests, and fall briefly, harmlessly in love. As dusk falls, torches ignite along the square. The music grows louder, faster. Couples break away from the circle dances, slipping into shadowed lanes. Somewhere behind a barrel of ale, 2 young people share a kiss that tastes of cider and freedom. The church will scold them tomorrow. The landlords will raise rents again, but for tonight, none of it matters. They have light, warmth, and each other's laughter. You stand near the fire, watching sparks rise into the dark. Someone presses a cup of wine into your hand. It's sweet and smoky, and you realize that for all its hardship, the medieval world knew how to savor fleeting joy. The people here had seen famine, plague, and war, yet they still believed in celebration, not as luxury, but as survival. Festivals weren't just entertainment. They were reminders that life and love were worth the struggle. The drums slow now, turning to a heartbeat rhythm. Couples rest, heads on shoulders. Children fall asleep in hay carts. Somewhere, A fiddler hums the last verse of a love song about two peasants who danced so long their shadows stayed behind after dawn. The air cools, and the fire settles to embers. You look around and see only smiles, the kind that come from simple happiness, unpolished but real. And in that moment, you understand that love in the Middle Ages wasn't always grand or tragic. Sometimes it was as small and perfect as this: two people meeting by chance at a feast, laughing under torchlight, promising nothing but the memory of warmth. The stars above blink awake, bright as spilled mead, and the last tune fades into silence. The feast is over, but its heartbeat lingers, echoing softly down the centuries, proof that even in a world of rules and repentance, people never stopped finding excuses to dance, drink, and fall in love by firelight. You wake again to a softer world, one lit not by torches or prayer candles, but by sunlight glinting on silk. The marketplace has been replaced by a hall of mirrors, metaphorically speaking, because beauty in medieval Europe was both obsession and illusion. You step through a wooden door into a noblewoman's chamber, where servants are mixing crushed pearls into vinegar, plucking stray hairs and whispering gossip about who has the palest skin this season. Every pot, every comb, every scrap of fabric in this room has something to do with love, because attraction here isn't spontaneous, it's constructed, curated, and fiercely defended by fashion. In this century, the ideal face belonged not to the gods but to the court. A mainstream historical fact sets the tone. During the 14th and 15th centuries, noblewomen across Europe followed a shared aesthetic that prized pale, flawless skin, a sign you didn't labor in the sun, high foreheads, thought to symbolize intellect and purity, and narrow shoulders. Men, for their part, aspired to lean athleticism, tournament-ready yet delicate enough to write a poem afterward. Love, therefore, began not with words but with surfaces. A lady's complexion could mean the difference between being serenaded and being overlooked, so she turned her bedroom into a laboratory. Vinegar-soaked cloths, milk baths, powdered lead, and even arsenic found their way into cosmetics, because when your reputation depends on radiance, a little poisoning feels like a fair gamble. You watch as a lady sits before her polished silver mirror. Glass mirrors are still rare, while her maid grinds woad to tint her veins subtly blue beneath the skin. Another smooths beeswax over her eyebrows, then plucks the rest away entirely. Fashion demands a broad, bare forehead. A husband might not notice his wife's thoughts, but heaven help him if he failed to notice her hairline. Men, meanwhile, powder their faces, scent their beards with ambergris, and sharpen their bejeweled belts until they gleam like armor. Courtship was a costume drama long before the word existed. The church predictably wrung its hands. Preachers thundered from pulpits about vanity, declaring that God alone should shape beauty. Yet behind closed doors even nuns exchanged recipes for herbal rinses that made skin glow without sin. One Dominican friar recorded grudgingly that women's adornment aids the harmony of marriage, which sounds suspiciously like an early attempt at damage control. Still, sermons couldn't stop the glitter. The more the clergy condemned luxury, the more creative the courtiers became. Here, a quirky tidbit glimmers. In France and Burgundy, lovers exchanged love belts and girdles made of silk or embroidered leather, meant to rest near the heart or lower. Some were inscribed with charms for fidelity, others with cheeky verses. It was a romantic gesture that doubled as a very fashionable brag. For the peasantry, love tokens were simpler: ribbons, carved spoons, or flowers tucked into caps. But even in villages, people mimicked the trends of the elite as best they could. A farmer's daughter might bleach her linen dress with lye to seem nobler. A shepherd might braid his sweetheart's hair in the courtly style, even if both smelled faintly of sheep. The tension between sincerity and display made beauty both weapon and prison. Women knew their looks were currency, but they wielded that currency skillfully. Behind every elegant sleeve and jeweled headdress was a calculus of survival. How to attract attention without scandal. How to appear desirable without being accused of pride. Men faced their own dilemma. To woo with courage was admirable, but to appear vain was unmanly. So they strutted in velvet doublets while pretending they hadn't looked in a mirror for weeks. Hypocrisy, in fashion as in faith, was practically a sport, and yet beneath the powder and pomp, real affection bloomed. Beauty rituals weren't merely vanity. They were a language of care. A woman perfuming her hair with rosemary wasn't just trying to look holy, she was preparing to be seen, to be remembered. A man tightening his belt before entering the hall wasn't only adjusting his armor, he was bracing himself for vulnerability. Love needed its theater, and fashion was the stage. You stroll through a hall lined with tapestries, watching the swirl of color, crimson gowns, green hoods, gold-threaded sleeves. The air hums with perfume, lute music and laughter. Couples exchange glances over goblets, and you realize that beauty here isn't about perfection at all. It's about communication. Every thread says something. I am worthy of your gaze. I have imagined you imagining me. The irony, of course, is that in trying to look divine, they became profoundly human. As night falls, the court empties, leaving stray petals and perfume hanging in the air. Somewhere, a woman wipes away her lead powder, a man removes his jeweled belt, and both catch sight of their bare reflections in the dim light. For a heartbeat, they're just people again. Tired, hopeful, a little foolish. Tomorrow they'll dress the part once more. Because love in the Middle Ages, like now, was half truth and half performance. And in that delicate balance between artifice and sincerity, something real and tender always managed to slip through like candlelight through silk. The scent of perfume and laughter fades, replaced by the acrid tang of smoke and something darker, ashes, herbs, and fear. The sky above the medieval world has dimmed. The bells no longer ring for weddings but for funerals, and the streets you walk through are silent except for the shuffle of carts carrying the dead. This is what love looks like when the world stops touching. The year is somewhere between 1347 and 1351. The Black Death is everywhere, and yet, against all logic, people still fall in love. You can almost see them, faces half covered in linen, eyes searching each other from across a courtyard, a kind of desperate tenderness born from knowing tomorrow might never come. A mainstream historical fact grounds this nightmarish beauty. In just a few short years, the plague wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, reshaping every aspect of society, including intimacy. Priests refused to perform weddings for fear of infection, convents sealed their gates, and the church condemned public affection as both immoral and dangerous. Even so, couples clung together in defiance of the silence. Records survive of secret marriages performed in barns, of widows remarrying before their mourning veils had even dried, of lovers kissing behind masks soaked in vinegar. Death had made the rules irrelevant. If love was a sin, it was the only sin left worth committing. You pass through a marketplace that smells of rot and rosemary. Every shop door bears a painted cross. Someone has left a bunch of dried flowers, posies meant to ward off the bad air, on a doorstep beside a loaf of bread. A man hums softly to his wife as he ties a cloth over her face. Their eyes meet, a moment of quiet fear and devotion. In another age, they might have courted through poetry and gifts. Now, the act of tending to each other's bandages is its own kind of vow. The people who survive this world love differently. They love without pretense, without games. They love the way drowning people breathe, grasping, fierce, immediate. And yet, the human need to make sense of chaos turns even this catastrophe into a strange kind of romance. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, witnessing the horror in Florence, penned the Decameron, a collection of love stories told by 10 nobles hiding from the plague in the countryside. His lovers are bawdy, brave, reckless, alive. Their tales shimmer precisely because the world outside is dying. Scholars still debate whether the Decameron was escapism or defiance, but perhaps it was both. When surrounded by death, stories of love become prayers, half laughter, half plea. Here comes a darker, quirkier tidbit. Some believed the plague was punishment for lust, while others claimed love-making itself could protect against it, since passion warmed the humors and expelled disease. You can imagine the theological arguments that followed. Physicians prescribed perfume and prayer. Lovers prescribed each other. Meanwhile, perfumers sold plague pomanders, metal balls filled with cloves and amber, which couples wore around their necks when they dared to meet. A few of those pomanders still exist, their silver etched with initials, testimonies of affection surviving centuries longer than the hands that held them. You step into a small chapel, its air thick with incense and smoke. Candles burn low beside a statue of the Virgin Mary, her marble face streaked with candle wax tears. In the corner, two lovers kneel apart, praying, their hands stretched toward one another but not touching. The distance between them hums like a physical thing, holy, unbearable. The priest's voice cracks as he murmurs blessings for the dying, and you realize that in this world love itself has become a form of worship. Every caress is a prayer, every whisper a confession. The church could not contain it, nor could death. The plague, for all its horror, reminded people of what mattered most. In letters and wills, husbands left instructions to bury them beside their wives so we may rise together. Widows carved small hearts into the wooden lids of coffins before they were sealed. Even graveyards became places of strange devotion where mourners wept for lost loves and the living met new ones while burying the dead. The boundaries between life and loss blurred. You can almost hear it in the music that followed. Slow minor melodies played on lutes and flutes, songs not of despair but of survival. I love, therefore I am still alive. You walk outside again into the cold evening air. The stars above look sharper than usual, as if the heavens themselves have been scoured clean. A woman lights a lantern in her window, the ancient signal of hope. Across the street, a man does the same. 2 points of light flicker through the fog, trembling but steady. That's all love needs, 2 flames refusing to go out. And as you stand there, breathing through linen and fear, you understand what medieval lovers already knew, that affection isn't fragile, it's defiant. It survives plagues, wars, sermons, and centuries. When the world collapses, love becomes both rebellion and refuge, a way of saying, if I must perish, let me perish, feeling something warm. You watch the lanterns sway in the dark, and somewhere beneath the coughing and the tolling bells, a laugh escapes from a nearby doorway. Soft, reckless, impossibly human. Because even here, even now, life insists on being loved. You follow the scent of salt and smoke to a windswept port, where ships with tattered sails creak against the harbor's rope-worn posts. The Mediterranean stretches wide, the horizon a silver-blue blur, and you can almost hear the distant clash of swords as knights prepare to leave for the Holy Land. Yet, amid all this preparation, love persists, not on battlefields but on paper. Letters, folded and sealed, become lifelines, carrying desire across seas, mountains, and weeks of peril. The ink may smudge in storms, the courier may die of illness or ambush, yet the words survive, confessions of longing, pleas for fidelity, and promises whispered across impossible distances. A mainstream historical fact anchors this reality. During the 12th and 13th centuries, soldiers and nobles on crusade routinely wrote letters to their wives, betrothed or lovers, sometimes crossing hundreds of miles. These missives were treasured, copied, and sometimes even smuggled past inquisitive hands, demonstrating that affection could thrive despite war, fear, and religious duty. You can imagine a young knight sitting on the deck of a ship, quill in hand, salt stinging his eyes as he writes. Each stroke is deliberate, his hand trembling with cold fear and anticipation. "My dearest," he begins, the words heavy with longing, "I leave for a land far from your sight, but not from my heart." He pauses to dip his quill again in ink, careful not to blot the precious parchment. Beyond the railing, waves pound against the hull. Seagulls cry. The horizon seems endless, and in that vast emptiness love must be pinned to paper to survive. Letters became proof, not only of passion, but of fidelity. A single miscopied line could cause months of anxiety. A "My Lady" turned to "My Lord" by a trembling hand could be interpreted as infidelity, heresy, or folly. A fringe tidbit floats here. Some crusaders purportedly included charms or small talismans in their letters, believing they would protect the recipient or the letter itself from harm. Tiny sprigs of rosemary, fragments of parchment inscribed with prayers, or even a lock of hair might accompany a missive. If the letter arrived intact, it was considered a blessing. If lost, the sender might interpret it as a sign from heaven or doom. Scholars still debate whether these charms had genuine ritual value or were psychological aids, giving hope when all else failed. Either way, their presence underscores the desperation and devotion wrapped into every syllable. You step into a stone room, where the walls smell of damp and ink. A scribe sits cross-legged, copying letters before they are rolled and sealed, making sure every word is legible and fragrant with cedarwood or herbs. The room is filled with the quiet rhythm of quills scratching across parchment, interrupted by the occasional cough from the cold stone floor. Here, the human heart battles time and distance with every fold and seal. Even when the Knight of Antioch or the Baron of Tripoli faced imminent death, they still found the will to write, "I think of you each day as I drink my meager wine, and I pray the same sun touches you that warms me now." Their words are small miracles, surviving both plague and battle to reach the distant beloved. The sea is relentless. Storms batter the ships. Letters are sometimes lost, carried away by waves, leaving hearts in despair. Yet many arrive, worn and scented, carrying whispers of kisses that could not be shared, of laughter remembered, of promises never broken. These letters became the backbone of emotional life for warriors far from home. In a world defined by duty and danger, paper and ink carried intimacy in a way that swords and armor could not. Some letters even contained instructions for courtship, gifts to be delivered, or coded signals meant to test the fidelity of the one left behind. A particularly human moment emerges in the historical record. Some knights instructed their servants to plant kisses on the recipient's hand or cheek before the letter was delivered, adding a physical trace of affection. Others included simple drawings, hearts, or sketches of the ship on which they sailed, connecting the distant lover to their presence. It's extraordinary how much effort went into bridging space and danger, how love became a navigation problem alongside maps and tides. Every missive is a small act of faith. You follow one such letter into the future, into the hands of a noblewoman in her candle-lit chamber. She opens it carefully, inhaling the faint scent of the sender and the sea. Her fingers trace the quill marks as though touching the knight himself. Each word carries longing, fear, and hope. Her eyes shine, her cheeks flush, and she whispers the syllables aloud, committing them to memory before reading again. Even decades later, these letters survive, bound in collections, in margins of prayer books, or simply remembered as stories of devotion. They are proof that love can be written, carried, and treasured, even when the physical presence of the beloved is impossible. The day turns to night, the harbor quiets, and only the distant echo of waves remains. Somewhere across the sea, another knight writes another letter. Somewhere, a young woman waits with bated breath for the messenger, and you realize that love in this time, in this place, is a testament to patience, courage, and ingenuity. Letters, fragile and ephemeral, become eternal. They are lifelines, symbols and evidence that, Even in the face of warfare, disease, and separation, the human heart insists on connection. And as the candle flickers low beside her window, you understand. Distance and danger may shape love, but they cannot destroy it. The morning sun glints off a weathered graveyard as you walk among moss-covered stones, each one a reminder of the fragility of life in medieval Europe. Death was everywhere. Every hearth smelled faintly of smoke and incense. Every bell tolled for someone's passing. But love, relentless as ever, found ways to return. Widows and widowers navigated this perilous world with hearts still tender, sometimes raw, and an uncanny resilience. They were the living testament to the idea that even when one chapter closes, another could begin, if only they dared to step into it. The world outside mourned and moved on, but these survivors often moved faster than the living expected, weaving second chances into the tapestry of daily life. A mainstream historical fact anchors this age of renewal. In medieval Europe, remarriage was not only socially acceptable, but often economically necessary. Widows, particularly those of the upper classes, frequently inherited dowries, lands, and titles. Remarriage was a strategic choice, consolidating property, protecting children, and securing alliances. But even among common folk, widows and widowers rarely remained alone. Community and survival dictated that emotional bonds be reformed, often swiftly, though they were tempered by grief. They approached love differently, with caution, wisdom, and sometimes a quiet cunning, recognizing that desire could be both a comfort and a liability. You can see it now, a widow tending her garden, her eyes lingering on the knight who brings wood for the hearth. He is neither young nor particularly handsome by courtly standards, but he is steady, reliable, and kind, the living embodiment of what the heart needs after loss. She waits for no formal announcement, no approval from her late husband's family. She smiles, knowing the first few words will be measured, calculated, yet thrilling in their potential. Every conversation, every glance, is an experiment in trust, built on the ruins of past grief. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. In some regions, widows were allowed to retain their late husband's clothing for an entire year and a day as a ritual of mourning. Only after this period could they remarry without social censure. During this time, they were thought to possess a kind of heightened wisdom, and suitors were expected to approach cautiously, acknowledging the widow's experience and grief. Some took this literally, courting women who were officially in mourning with letters, poems, or gifts hidden under the veil of ceremony. Scholars debate whether this period was purely symbolic or strictly enforced, but the cultural weight was undeniable. You step into a small hall where widowers gather for counsel and company. They share stories of love lost, of children orphaned, and of estates to manage. But amid these tales there is laughter, subtle flirtation, and cautious glances at women passing in the courtyard. For many, remarriage represents a practical solution, a merging of families and fortunes, yet it also allows hearts to heal and rediscover desire. In letters preserved in French archives, widowers describe waking each morning, missing a beloved spouse, yet finding themselves intrigued by a neighbor or companion, their words balancing reverence for the past with hope for the future. The juxtaposition of grief and attraction creates a delicate tension. You can almost feel it, the way a woman reaches for a cup of wine just a little too eagerly when a suitor enters, or how a widower's hand trembles when he returns a bow. Every interaction carries history, and yet it is infused with possibility. The medieval imagination allowed for these second chances in ways that were socially structured. Contracts, dowries, and church oversight guided unions, but emotion still found its place. People could grieve responsibly while daring to hope again, which is itself an extraordinary feat in an age dominated by mortality. A particular historical anecdote illuminates this world. In 14th century England, a widow named Lady Margery remarried within weeks of her husband's death. a union that initially scandalized the court. Yet her new husband turned out to be remarkably devoted, supporting her children, sharing her household responsibilities, and respecting her previous obligations. Their letters reveal a partnership that was both pragmatic and affectionate, suggesting that love, when approached with intention, could be both socially acceptable and genuinely rewarding. You walk down a quiet lane now, imagining the everyday courage required of these men and women. Each decision to remarry, to write a letter, to smile at a new companion is fraught with risk of gossip, misjudgment, or repeated heartbreak. Yet for those who dared, life offered intimacy, warmth, and the continuation of human connection. You realize that medieval widows and widowers were some of the bravest people imaginable, navigating a world where love and loss were inseparable, yet refusing to let grief dictate the end of desire. As the sun dips lower, casting long shadows over the tombstones, you notice a pair walking hand in hand through the graveyard. Their steps are careful, measured, and deliberate. Perhaps they are newly united, or perhaps they have loved before and are rediscovering one another. Either way, the act itself, the choosing of love after loss, is monumental. In a time when death was omnipresent, each heartbeat of affection became both defiance and hope, proof that humanity refuses to surrender to despair. And in the quiet that follows, you understand that even amid mortality, the medieval heart insists on moving forward, daring to beat, and daring to love again. You step into the bustle of a medieval street where the market smells of fresh bread, salt, and livestock, and the hum of conversation rises like the swell of a tide. Here, love is a complicated dance, not just of hearts but of hierarchies. You see the wealthy merchant leaning just slightly closer to the baker's daughter, exchanging glances over loaves of bread, the weight of unspoken rules pressing between them. Across the square, a noblewoman in silk skirts walks past a young squire, and though etiquette forbids more than a fleeting glance, the air trembles with potential. In medieval Europe, love rarely obeyed the rigid boundaries of class, though the consequences for crossing them could be catastrophic. A mainstream historical fact anchors this tension. Social hierarchies were enforced rigorously, especially in towns and cities, where guilds, noble privileges, and laws dictated interaction. Marriages across classes were rare and often illegal, particularly among the nobility, because lineage was considered essential to inheritance, alliance, and political stability. Yet stories and letters from the era show that such unions did occur, sometimes sanctioned quietly by a sympathetic cleric or arranged secretly when families were distracted or absent. The fact that these relationships existed at all reveals how resilient human desire can be when pitted against rules, rituals, and rigid societal norms. You imagine a clandestine meeting at twilight behind the baker's shop. The daughter and the young merchant exchange folded notes, each inked line trembling with hope and fear. "Do you dare meet me at midnight?" she writes, slipping the note under a heavy barrel. He smiles faintly, nods to a passing donkey, and retrieves it later, the parchment smelling faintly of flour and longing. Their love is alive in the stolen gestures, a brush of hands, a whispered name, a shared loaf. Such small acts, seemingly inconsequential, carry the weight of rebellion. They are love's private rituals in a world that publicly forbade it. A quirky anecdote exists from the 15th century. In some English villages, young men of noble birth would temporarily dress as peasants to court women of lower rank. One chronicler recounts a knight hiding his tunic beneath a farmer's coat, secretly wooing a girl who blushed at the sight of velvet, unaware that she had been wooed by wealth disguised as humility. These playful deceptions could lead to actual marriage if the families approved, or ruin if discovered. Scholars debate whether these disguises were genuinely about love or simply the thrill of breaking social norms, but either way they highlight how imagination and courage allowed affection to flourish despite systemic constraints. The consequences of love across class lines were stark. Lovers caught in transgression risked exile, fines, public shaming, or worse. Families keen to preserve property and honor might dissolve engagements, destroy letters, or arrange marriages to safer partners. Yet the desire persisted, undeterred. You can almost see a young woman clutching a letter close to her chest as she sneaks past a watchful servant, her pulse quick, eyes wide, dreaming of a future that may never arrive. Even among the upper classes, affection often traversed invisible boundaries. Minstrels and servants sometimes became trusted confidants for nobles' secret love affairs. Letters, gifts, and coded messages were passed through these intermediaries, creating a hidden web of connection that allowed romance to exist under the scrutiny of court, church, and kin. The sheer inventiveness required to navigate these constraints speaks to both the creativity of love and the strictures imposed by society. You wander into a sunlit garden, where the wealthy may stroll and peasants may linger at the edges, exchanging glances, gestures, and subtle notes. Each encounter carries risk, yet also exhilaration. In this crucible, affection becomes intense precisely because it is forbidden, fleeting, and fragile. Every touch is electric, every shared glance a small victory. It is the thrill of invisibility combined with the human need for intimacy. Some stories end happily. The peasant rises in status, the noble falls in love and abandons protocol, or the couple escapes under cover of darkness to marry elsewhere. Others end tragically, with exile, imprisonment, or separation by death or decree. Yet the human impulse to reach across class lines persists. It is a quiet rebellion, evidence that social hierarchy, no matter how rigid, cannot extinguish desire. The marketplace grows still as twilight deepens. You watch shadows stretch along the cobblestones. Somewhere, a hand brushes another hand. Brief, electric, deliberate. The air hums with possibility and risk. You understand, standing there, that love in the Middle Ages thrived not in spite of rules but because it challenged them, finding expression in whispered gestures, secret vows, and fleeting connections. In crossing class lines it claimed its own sovereignty, asserting that human hearts, like rivers, cannot be contained by walls, status, or law. As darkness falls and torches flicker on the walls, you notice a young couple disappear into a narrow alley, wrapped in cloaks, laughing quietly at the audacity of their own defiance. And you realize that, in this ancient world of rigid orders and social hierarchies, love's persistence, its audacity and courage is itself a kind of magic, one that endures long after the stones, the laws, and the stories of the streets have faded. You step once more into a vast cathedral, where sunlight filters through stained glass, casting a kaleidoscope of color across the cold stone floor. The scent of incense hangs heavy, curling around pillars like invisible hands. Here, love is policed, whispered about, and sometimes condemned outright. The Church, omnipresent and omniscient in medieval life, claimed authority over hearts as well as souls. Every gesture, every union, every stolen glance could be scrutinized through a theological lens. Love to the clergy was a potent force, divine in inspiration but perilous in practice. You can almost hear the echoes of sermons admonishing, cautioning, and occasionally warning that desire left unchecked could imperil both body and soul. A mainstream historical fact grounds this authority. By the 13th century, canon law had extended the Church's power over marital relations, prohibiting unions within prohibited degrees of kinship, enforcing consent requirements, and occasionally annulling marriages deemed inappropriate. Clerics argued that human desire could easily lead to sin, and thus every aspect of love from engagement to consummation was subject to oversight. The Church's influence pervaded even private correspondence, with confessors sometimes questioning the fidelity or intentions of those in love. This omnipresence created a tension. The more the clergy tried to regulate affection, the more creative people became in hiding and expressing it. You imagine a young couple kneeling for confession, hearts pounding, as the priest probes gently, carefully. "Do you love with purity?" he asks, eyes narrowing. They answer cautiously, leaving out the truer, more passionate moments they shared in the garden at night, under the cover of darkness. The church required confession, oversight, and penance, yet desire did not obey rules. A whispered vow behind the altar, a glance from across the nave, a subtle brush of hands, these became revolutionary acts in a world ruled by faith and doctrine. A quirky tidbit emerges. In some medieval towns, the church issued licenses for couples to meet in private under clerical supervision if they were deemed too closely related by social custom but not by law, creating an oddly bureaucratic path to intimacy. Scholars still debate whether such arrangements were pragmatic responses to human desire or sly exploitations of loopholes, but either way, they reveal the persistent tension between ecclesiastical authority and personal affection. The Church's interventions were both protective and controlling, a paradox that shaped every aspect of medieval courtship. The cathedral hums with whispered prayers and distant organ music. You imagine the same space hosting clandestine exchanges of affection. Letters left hidden in pews, coded gestures passed beneath prayer books, fleeting kisses disguised as blessings. The clerics, invested in morality, were often unaware that the very rules they enforced provided the structure for these secret rebellions. Forbidden glances and whispered promises took on heightened intensity precisely because they were surveilled, transforming ordinary longing into acts of quiet heroism. You wander down the nave, noticing frescoes depicting saints in acts of devotion. Their hands reach outward, their eyes soft with compassion, and you can't help imagining the irony. Human desire, imperfect and insistent, thriving under the shadow of divine figures. Stories survive of lovers defying the church to marry secretly or continuing correspondence under the guise of spiritual discussion. One record tells of a noblewoman who carried letters in her rosary beads, and a knight who wrote confessional-style poetry to convey his devotion safe from scrutiny if read by the wrong eyes. The church's meddling also extended into daily life. Feast days, pilgrimages, and even communal dances were monitored for impropriety. Clerics warned against dancing too closely, touching hands, or sharing too many words after Mass, claiming that these could inflame passions. Yet, paradoxically, these very restrictions intensified desire, making every accidental touch, whispered compliment, or lingering look charged with forbidden electricity. You can feel the pulse of the city outside the cathedral walls, the thrill of risk, the creativity it inspired, the quiet rebellions that gave love both flavor and danger. You follow a pair of young lovers to a shadowed alcove near a side door. They clasp hands, careful to avoid being seen, exchanging vows not of legality but of commitment. The priest's footsteps echo faintly in the distance, reminding them that all joy is provisional, all freedom conditional. Yet the act itself is profound, an affirmation that love can persist under constraint, bending around barriers, finding spaces in which to thrive. The sun dips lower, casting colored light over carved pews. Candle flames flicker in gentle draft. You notice that even as the church attempted to control desire, it inadvertently created a stage for ingenuity, courage, and intimacy. Lovers learn to communicate in code, to hide affection in plain sight, and to treasure each stolen moment as sacred. And you understand, standing there in the hush of reverent stone, that while the church could dictate the rules, it could not dictate the human heart. For every sermon, every prohibition, every anxious glance from the pulpit, love persisted, elegant, subtle, and indomitable, threading its way through centuries of devotion and defiance alike. The streets are alive once more, but this time with music that spills beyond courtly halls into taverns, marketplaces, and crowded squares. The hum of lute strings, the tap of wooden clogs, and the rising laughter form a rhythm that carries desire on its wings. Here, love is not private, secretive or constrained by hierarchy. It is performance, broadcast for all to witness. Minstrels, the traveling storytellers of medieval Europe, carry tales of passion, heartbreak, and triumph from town to town, their songs shaping public imagination and defining what love ought to be, or at least what it ought to sound like. You step closer to the gathering crowd, the smell of ale and roasted meat mingling with the subtle scent of perfume and dust, and you can almost feel the music wrapping around your heart. A mainstream historical fact frames this scene. From the 12th century onward, minstrels and jongleurs were essential cultural figures, often under royal or noble patronage, who performed poetry, ballads, and songs recounting romantic adventures. Their repertoire included tales of knightly devotion, secret love affairs, and courtly misadventures, and these performances shaped expectations of behavior, ideals of beauty, and even strategies of courtship. Unlike private letters or confessional whispers, these songs were public, creating a shared consciousness of what love meant and how it should be expressed. A love once secret could become legendary simply by the virtue of being sung. Imagine a minstrel kneeling on the steps of a guild hall, lute in hand, eyes gleaming as he recites a ballad about a young maiden and a traveling knight who exchanged secret letters under the noses of her parents. Every note is exaggerated, every pause deliberate. The audience gasps, laughs, and murmurs knowingly, recognizing their own stolen glances, hidden vows, and risky embraces. Minstrels did not merely entertain. They educated, instructing young men in the arts of poetic praise, subtlety, and courage, and showing women how to receive attention with both grace and cunning. The music becomes a classroom of desire, teaching skill as much as feeling. A quirky historical tidbit emerges from these gatherings. Some minstrels would carry coded messages within their songs, embedding names, locations, or secret instructions for couples too timid to speak. A verse about a rose hidden in the window might indicate a rendezvous. A tale of a knight losing his way in a forest could be a warning of danger. Scholars still debate how widespread this practice was, but the very possibility adds a layer of intrigue. Love, creativity, and performance intertwined, turning the simplest melody into a tool of clandestine romance. Public performances were not without danger. A ballad praising a noblewoman could bring her into social scandal if overheard by an unsympathetic relative. A minstrel misinterpreted could be imprisoned or fined for insulting a patron. Yet, despite these risks, love thrived in the performance, transformed into communal drama. A young woman might blush at a song referencing her house. A man might gain courage from hearing his own deeds sung aloud. Music, it seems, amplified desire, allowing it to exist in plain sight without immediate consequence, its reach simultaneously expansive and controlled by the performer's wit. You imagine a festival evening, torches flickering along the cobblestones, the minstrel's voice echoing off the walls of timbered houses. Couples cluster, holding hands under blankets, leaning against posts, sharing a look that is both a promise and a secret. The lyrics narrate feats of courage, devotion, and stolen kisses. The story becomes instruction and inspiration, shaping how people act in love, how they flirt, how they risk and hope. Even the poorest peasant or the simplest artisan absorbs the cultural rhythm of affection, learning when to bow, when to joke, and how to convey longing without words. These public expressions created a feedback loop. The more popular the story, the more people emulated it, turning legend into lived experience. Songs about noble knights inspired real suitors. Tales of clever maids inspired real women to test their own agency. Love, mediated by performance, becomes performative in turn. Courtship, a series of rehearsed gestures guided by art, expectation, and observation. In this environment, desire is both natural and learned, spontaneous and scripted, private in intention yet public in display. As the minstrel strums the final chord, the audience erupts into applause and laughter. Lovers exchange glances, hands squeeze, and some take the courage to approach one another for the first time. The music lingers in the air, blending with the smell of evening fires and the faint scent of autumn leaves. You watch as a young couple walks off toward the town's edge, laughter spilling from their lips, courage newfound from the song they have heard. Even centuries later, you sense the echo of this culture. Love as drama, desire as art, performance as teaching. Night deepens. The tavern's quiet, the streets empty. Yet somewhere in the dark, music still hums in memory, and love, emboldened by verse and melody, continues its patient, playful, audacious work. In medieval Europe, it seems, romance was never purely private. It was public, performative, and above all unstoppable. The road stretches ahead, sun-warmed and dusty, lined with wild flowers and worn stone crosses, as you follow pilgrims on foot, mule or cart. Love takes a physical form here, intertwined with devotion and the ritual of travel. Medieval Europe saw countless pilgrimages, not just to holy shrines but to courts, towns, and distant villages where secret love awaited. Pilgrimage was both spiritual journey and social mobility. For lovers, it was a way to express commitment, endure hardship together, and sometimes escape the scrutiny of family or church. You can almost feel the heat of the sun on shoulders, the weight of leather and cloth, the rhythmic shuffle of footsteps over worn cobbles. Here, love moves slowly, painfully, but with determination. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Pilgrimages to sites like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome were enormously popular from the 12th century onward. Devotees walked long distances, carrying badges or tokens to prove their faith. Along the way, pilgrims encountered towns, inns, and markets, exchanging greetings and stories. For those in love, such journeys offered moments of privacy, quiet conversation, shared hardship, and opportunities to express devotion away from the watchful eyes of family or community. Letters and tokens might be exchanged mid-journey, pledges whispered by riverbanks or under moonlit trees. You can imagine a young couple, a merchant's daughter and a squire, walking side by side along a hill path. Their hands brush beneath a cloak. They speak little, because words feel too fragile for the intensity of the moment. A coin drops from the squire's pouch, and he bends to retrieve it, giving her a chance to smile, a small gesture that carries the weight of promise. They rest at a wayside chapel, lighting candles for the saints and for each other, blending sacred devotion with human desire. Pilgrimage here is both test and courtship. The ability to endure hardship together proves worthiness, patience, and steadfastness. A quirky tidbit: some couples undertook love pilgrimages to sites rumored to enhance affection or fertility, blending superstition with genuine longing. Shrines of St. Valentine, St. Anne, or lesser-known local saints were popular destinations. Pilgrims might leave small gifts, carved tokens, or written vows in hope of divine blessing. Scholars debate whether these acts were truly spiritual or purely performative, a way to give love ritual legitimacy. Either way, they highlight the entwining of faith, magic, and romance in daily life. You watch them continue, boots scraping pebbles, cloaks fluttering, sweat mingling with dust and pollen. Along the way, they encounter fellow travelers exchanging songs, stories, and advice. A musician strums a simple melody, and the squire hums along for her amusement. Every step is a statement. Love is worth endurance. Love is worth risk. And love, when paired with devotion, carries its own sacred authority. The pilgrimage itself becomes a metaphor, a narrative of longing and fidelity enacted in real terrain. Challenges abound. Rain-soaked paths, swollen rivers, or encounters with highwaymen test resolve. Letters may be lost, tokens stolen, or intentions misread. Yet for those who persevere, every obstacle strengthens the bond. Pilgrimage transforms desire from fleeting attraction into shared experience, a narrative that binds two lives together through common trials and triumphs. There is a profound honesty in this. Love, like faith, requires action, courage, and endurance. Along the route, you notice an elderly couple walking slowly, hands entwined, their journey measured and deliberate. Perhaps they have walked this path many times, their affection deepened by repetition and survival. Younger lovers watch them with awe and hope. The act of traveling together, of facing the road's uncertainties side by side, becomes a living testament to commitment. Pilgrimage is not just spiritual, it is relational. As the day wanes, the couple reaches a small chapel perched on a hill. They leave a carved token inside, a symbol of devotion, hope, and courage. Candles flicker in the dim interior, illuminating their flushed faces and clasped hands. Here, in this quiet convergence of faith and affection, love finds its ritual form. Pilgrimages, arduous and demanding, become arenas for testing fidelity, courage, and mutual devotion. Each mile walked is a mile toward understanding, intimacy, and the sacredness of choice. You step back onto the road as the sun sets, golden light painting the distant hills. The pilgrims disappear into the evening mist, and you are left with the hum of human hope carried on wind and footfall. Love, you realize, thrives in movement, in shared journey, and in the willingness to endure together. Even in an age ruled by duty, death, and devotion, the pilgrimage proves that desire can find expression in the most arduous and profound of paths. You slip quietly through a narrow, ivy-covered alleyway, the smell of wet stone and blooming flowers mingling with the faint smoke of nearby hearths. Here, in the hidden corners of medieval towns and estates, love found its sanctuary away from prying eyes, gossiping neighbors, and the rigid watch of family and church. Secret gardens, walled courtyards, and concealed glades became stages for stolen glances, whispered words, and gentle touches. The air is heavy with roses, mint, and the subtle sweetness of secrecy, as though the very atmosphere conspires to protect what blooms here. You can hear the soft rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a fountain, and the faint laughter of a pair daring to break the rules simply by being together. A mainstream historical fact gives structure to this clandestine world. In late medieval Europe, noble estates often contained walled gardens, horti conclusi, intended for private meditation, prayer, or reflection. These spaces, while primarily ornamental or spiritual, became ideal sites for lovers to meet, protected by high walls and attendants instructed to look the other way. Courtly literature and poetry of the 13th and 14th centuries frequently describe these gardens as secret theaters of romance, places where the rules of hierarchy, propriety, and ceremony could be suspended, if only briefly. You imagine a young couple slipping through a hidden gate at twilight. She wears a simple gown and a veil, though its fabric cannot hide her excitement. He moves quietly, his boots soft against the grass, his heart thrumming with anticipation. They meet beneath a pergola, heavy with climbing roses, a space designed for contemplation yet alive with the pulse of human passion. Every whispered word, every stolen touch carries weight, because it is forbidden. Yet the very danger heightens desire. It is a rehearsal for courage, patience, and discretion, an intimacy sharpened by risk. A quirky historical tidbit: some gardens were planted deliberately with love herbs, rosemary, basil, and violets, thought to enhance desire or loyalty between partners. Visitors might pluck a leaf, crush petals in their hands, or hide a tiny bloom in a letter or cloak. Medieval belief held that the scent or symbolic presence of these plants could influence emotion, and couples treated the rituals with playful reverence. Scholars still debate whether these practices were genuine superstition, social theater, or simply clever excuses for flirting under the cover of botanical fascination. The garden, shaded by trellises and encircled by stone walls, hums with quiet magic. You can almost hear the faint scrawl of a lover's hand on parchment as he leaves a note beneath a rose bush: "Meet me where the lilies bend toward the sun." The note will be found later, perhaps weeks after it was placed, creating suspense, anticipation, and the thrill of delayed satisfaction. Each gesture, the folded letter, the hidden token, the whispered sentence, functions as both promise and performance, a ritual of patience and devotion. You observe the way the couple interacts. She laughs softly at his awkward attempt to hide behind a trellis. He grins, brushing a strand of hair from her face with trembling fingers. Every movement is heightened by secrecy, amplified by the knowledge that discovery could result in reprimand, scandal, or worse. Yet they persist. The garden transforms into a world apart, where love can breathe freely, unbound by etiquette, family expectations, or social hierarchy. The stone walls are both shelter and stage, and every blossom, vine, and shadow participates in their intimacy. Even small details matter. The placement of a hand, the timing of a kiss, the choice of a bench beneath a canopy of grapevines. Each is choreographed unconsciously, dictated by instinct, emotion, and the constraints of secrecy. Lovers measure distance and light, scent and sound, testing boundaries that could be fatal if misjudged. And yet within these constraints, joy flourishes. The thrill of being seen, the risk of discovery, the fleeting ownership of a private world, these elements make every meeting extraordinary. You step back into the path, where the sunlight filters dimly through leaves. Somewhere the couple slips away, hand in hand, carrying nothing but a token, a smile, and the memory of a moment stolen from the rigid world beyond the garden walls. You realize that in medieval Europe, love often thrived in hidden spaces, nurtured by secrecy and imagination, and that these quiet meetings were acts of rebellion, devotion, and courage all at once. In a world dominated by rules, surveillance, and expectation, the garden becomes sanctuary, and the lovers within it find freedom, however fleeting. As evening descends, shadows deepen across the walls and paths. The scent of roses lingers, mingling with the faint smoke of hearths beyond. You imagine hundreds of such gardens across Europe, each hosting countless stories of longing, courage, and connection, all hidden in plain sight. And as the last light fades, you understand. Sometimes the most enduring love is the kind that blooms in secret, nurtured not by ceremony, but by the quiet insistence of hearts daring to beat together against the rules of the world. The world slows as twilight settles softly over cobblestones, hills, and forests, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing gently against your shoulders. The air is cooler now, carrying the faint scent of earth, lavender, and distant wood smoke, the rhythm of your own breathing echoing the pulse of the past. Tonight you have walked through hidden gardens, crowded markets, shadowed cloisters, candlelit chambers, and sunlit fields, tracing the myriad ways hearts have found one another across centuries of rules, plagues, wars, and conventions. Each story, each gesture, each secret letter or stolen glance has led to this quiet moment, a pause in time when the world seems to exhale with you. You may feel your own heart softening, imagining lives lived with courage, humor, and tenderness in the midst of hardship. The medieval heart, you realize, is remarkably similar to your own. It yearns, risks, celebrates, hides, and rebels, all within the limits imposed by society, faith, or circumstance. Knights fought for love, not just honor. Nuns and monks wrestled with desire, even in cloistered devotion. Widows and widowers dared new connections. Peasants and nobles found ways to reach across class lines. Lovers eloped, wrote letters, and slipped through hidden gardens. Even during plagues and famines, people found reasons to touch, whisper, and hope. Every act of intimacy was a triumph, an assertion of life, a delicate flame burning through stone, cloth, and law. You breathe slowly and realize that the thrill of connection, the delight of shared affection, is timeless, unchanged in its importance or its quiet power. Imagine the sound of distant bells fading with the evening, the hush of forests settling into shadow, the gentle lapping of river water against mossy banks. Each sound mirrors the soft ebb of desire, the careful patience of hearts waiting, hoping, and daring again and again. There is no need for urgency here. The stories you have witnessed belong not to the frantic present, but to a calm reflection, where every smile, every letter, every hidden kiss can be appreciated for its courage and beauty. Even the smallest act, holding a hand across a bench, leaving a ribbon on a windowsill, whispering a name in the dark, resonates with meaning. In this quiet, you understand that love is less about grand declarations and more about presence, attention, and care. Let your mind linger on that thought, letting the warmth of human connection seep into your imagination. Picture the lovers you have met along this journey. Young, old, noble, peasant, cloistered, wandering, each with hearts that beat in defiance of fear, expectation, and mortality. Consider how their courage and creativity created pathways for affection that endured, inspiring songs, poems, legends, and memories that whisper to us even now. You may feel a gentle reassurance, knowing that love is not fragile. It adapts, endures, and thrives, even under the most challenging circumstances. Now, soften your thoughts further, letting the rhythms of your own breath mirror the gentle pulse of history. Imagine the glow of candlelight dimming, the last rustle of a page turned, the soft brush of fabric as someone leans close. Even in quiet solitude, these gestures, these echoes of medieval longing, invite reflection and calm. There is a peace in remembering that connection, desire, and devotion have always existed, quietly threading through human lives, persisting beyond walls, rules, and time itself. And as your mind drifts toward stillness, let the stories settle, allowing each memory of courage, laughter, longing, and hope to become part of the quiet evening around you. Let the gentle cadence of lives lived fully and hearts daring to love lull you, like a soft, protective embrace. Feel the warmth, the humor, the tenderness, and the bravery of centuries fold around you, softening every thought. And as your own eyelids grow heavy, you sense